LoveLore Library. Chapter 651. Outside an inconspicuous mansion in the west of Bien City, a strong man in military uniform knocked on the closed door. Not long after, someone came to answer the door. A young man who looked like a servant poked his head out and saw the person at the door. He was stunned and asked, "Excuse me, who are you looking for, General?" Ladingfing cupped his hands and smiled. "I'm Ladingfing. I'm here to pay my respects to General Jingtian. I hope you'll grant me an audience." Unexpectedly, the servant's face darkened and he said, "What General Jingtian? We don't have such a person in our family." "General, you've come to the wrong place." After that, without waiting for Ladingfing's reaction, he retracted his head and slammed the door. Looking at the door slamming in front of him, Ladingfing helplessly touched his nose and smiled bitterly. His father had a deep grudge with the old generals. It was only because his father was a famous general himself that he didn't need the help of the three generals. In fact, the three generals even hindered his father's power in the court. This was why he offended them so much. Ladingfing felt lucky that Zhu Yan just closed the door and did not directly let the dog out. Ladingfing could accept such treatment, but the generals and attendants behind Ladingfing could not. They were all people who were cultivated and promoted by Zenom of Gojoseon. They were more loyal to Jinan Palace than to the West Hill Court. Of course, they had heard of the names of the three great generals, but these three were old men with one foot in the grave. What's more, even if they had outstanding achievements, weren't they defeated by their prince? What arrogance! "Prince, I'll break the door down," the general behind Ladingfing said. Ladingfing waved his hand and said, "Leave, don't be rude." They waited outside the door for a while, but there was no more movement inside. Ladingfing thought for a moment, condensed his qi and internal energy, and said loudly, "Junior Ladingfing from Jinan Palace requests an audience with old General Zhu." In the Zhu estate, two white-haired old men were sitting in the main hall, facing off against a chessboard. Ladingfing's voice, which was infused with his inner strength, naturally entered their ears without any hindrance. One of them was an old man wearing a dark blue robe embroidered with the word fortune. He smiled and stroked his beard. He didn't look like a general who had gone to war, but more like a benevolent old immortal. Enchanting has been arrogant all his life. This son. I'm afraid he's not as good. The other old man was indeed skinny, but his eyes were clear and bright. He was dressed in white clothes made of coarse cloth. If it weren't for his eyes, he would have looked more like an ordinary old man from the mountains. It's said that like father, like son. But if the father is too powerful, it's hard for the son not to be overshadowed by the father. How many can there be like the one in the Prince Ding mansion? Moreover, if it weren't for the deaths of Mo Lufang and Mo Xiuan in the Prince Ding mansion in just a few years, the Prince Ding mansion would have suffered a great blow. Mo Xiuyao might not be as powerful as he is now. Maybe he's just a famous general. But now, Prince Ding's elegance and reputation had already surpassed his father and brother, and even all the ancestors under Mo Lanyun. The old man in blue sighed, "You're right. A sword's edge is sharpened by grinding, and the fragrance of plum blossoms comes from the bitter cold. Ladingfing's son, in the end, still hasn't been sharpened enough." The old man in white smiled. "This kid, compared to Ladingfing, he's more tolerant." In the past few decades, the Dechu state and the Ding mansion weren't the only ones who had suffered various blows. When Emperor Xianwen passed away, Ladingfing also wantonly eliminated dissidents after taking power. He killed or exiled a large number of famous officials and generals. If Emperor Xianwen could live for another 20 years, the current West Hill would definitely be in a completely different situation. It was a pity that Emperor Xianwen, who had a great reputation, chose a cowardly son to be the emperor. More importantly, he left behind a son like Ladingfing, who was better than the emperor in every aspect. How could the West Hill not be in chaos? Tolerant. The old man in blue threw down a chess piece and said lightly, now we can only take it that he's adapting to the circumstances. Based on his little experience on the battlefield, wanting to stop Mo Xiaoyao can be said to be wishful thinking. At this point, the two old men fell silent. They had already left the battlefield for more than 20 years and were already old. Not to mention Lei Tingfeng, it was still unknown whether they could stop the advance of the Mahist army. Mo Lufang not only has a good son, but also a good daughter-in-law. I heard that this time, Princess Ding also followed the army to battle. The old man in blue said with a smile. As for the Princess Ding who had once defeated Lei Jinting, the two old generals who had been on the battlefield for a long time would not underestimate her at all. A woman who could defeat or even almost wipe out the enemy in a situation where she did not have the advantage in terms of military strength was definitely not a person to be underestimated. Who knows, maybe this time we'll be able to meet this beautiful woman. General Zhu. Bian City is in danger. I beg you to put aside your past achievements for the sake of the West Hill's safety and grant me a meeting. Lei Tingfeng's voice came from outside again. The old man in blue, Jingtian General Zhu Yan, could not help but smile and said, this kid is really calm. Long Yang also smiled, if you don't see him, I'm afraid he won't leave. Besides, can you and I really watch Bian City fall without doing anything? Well, ask him to come in. Lei Tingfeng left his people outside and followed the servant into the Zhu mansion alone. He believed that even if Zhu Yan and his father had a deep grudge, he would not do anything to him at this time. And he went in alone. It would also seem to show his sincerity to the old general. Stepping into the hall, he saw two white-haired old men sitting and drinking tea. Lei Tingfeng was also surprised in his heart. When the three generals were removed from their military power, he seemed to be about 10 years old. The people in the royal family were always precocious and naturally had some impressions of these generals. Junior Lei Tingfeng greets General Zhu and General Long. Long Yang looked at him with a smile and said, you flatter me, Prince Rui of Genom of Gojoseon. We are just country people, we don't deserve the title of Prince General. Lei Tingfeng smiled bitterly and helplessly. He looked up at Long Yang and said sincerely, as a junior, Tingfeng does not dare to say too much about the past grievances. But now that the Mo family army has invaded the border and besieged Bian City, the West Hill is in danger. I hope that the two generals can give me some advice for the sake of my royal grandfather. For the sake of the late emperor. Long Yang sneered, when Lei Jinting excluded dissidents, why didn't he consider the late emperor's face? Feng Ao's whereabouts are still unknown. Why didn't Lei Jinting think that those people were the pillars of the West Hill and the late emperor's officials? Lei Tingfeng made a slip of the tongue. He could not refute Long Yang's question. Their standpoints were different. Even if Lei Tingfeng did not completely agree with his father's actions, he still had to admit that for the development of Jinan Palace, those thunderous measures were absolutely necessary. If those officials who were loyal to the late emperor and the current emperor's uncle had not been removed, Jinan Palace would never have the power it had today. But in the eyes of these old officials, his father's actions were no different from a state of chaos. The only thing that could be said was that the West Hill was still strong in his father's hands. Otherwise, those old officials would have attacked together before the Mahist army invaded. Chapter 652. He smiled helplessly. Now the crisis of Bian City is right in front of us. Please help us, old generals. Zhu Yan didn't speak, and Long Yang just snorted coldly. But Lei Tingfeng understood that they agreed, and he couldn't help but secretly feel relieved. The next day, the siege of the Mahist army was not as smooth as the previous days. The West Hill soldiers guarding the city seemed to have suddenly returned to their senses. Facing the murderous Mahist army, they were no longer as flustered and fearful as they were at the beginning. The defense on the tower was tight, and the entire Bien city was like an iron bucket that couldn't be broken. The siege lasted for a whole morning, and the defense of Bien city didn't weaken at all. This undoubtedly made the Mahist army generals, who had been going smoothly since the start of the expedition, feel a little anxious. At this time, their prince and princess didn't appear in front of the battle. It wasn't until near the afternoon that the Mahist army, who didn't make any progress, beat the gong to retreat. In the big tent, Mo Xiaoyao looked at the dusty generals in a good mood, without the slightest displeasure and anger. "Generals, how was it? Was today's battle easy?" Several young generals couldn't help but blush. Yesterday, they were the ones who clamored the most. Mo Xiaoyao smiled faintly. "Don't be embarrassed, I won't blame you. If you young people who haven't fought many battles easily took down Bien City, Long Yang and Zhu Yan wouldn't have the face to call themselves the three famous generals of West Hill. Although they are old now, you have to know that the old ones are spicy." Several young generals looked at each other, and then pushed out a person to reporting to Prince, "Bien City is completely different from the cities we attacked before. Not only are the walls strong, easy to defend and hard to attack, even the guards are completely different from the previous guards. The guards of Bien City are obviously braver and calmer. Before, we underestimated the enemy. This is the real fighting power of West Hill's army." Mo Xiaoyao nodded with satisfaction. "It's good that you understand. Don't worry. I'll give you 3 more days. Can you open the gate of Bien City?" Several young generals hesitated. They were all young generals who had been carefully trained by the Mahist army. Although they didn't have much experience in battle, once they put aside their previous arrogance, they could still see their position and ability clearly. Therefore, they were naturally happy that the prince could give them an important task. But now they were certain that they could take down Bien City within 3 days. They were still hesitant. Mo Xiaoyao raised his eyebrows. "What? Yesterday, you were still clamoring to flatten Bien City. Today, you've only fought a battle and you've already lost your courage." "No. We can." The Young's young generals. Comte General Ssmo Xiaoyao relaxed and leaned back in his chair. He nodded with satisfaction and smiled. "Very good. 3 days later, this prince wants to see Bien City's city gate open. And of the siege of the city. General Liu and the others have other matters to attend to. They are no longer in the camp." Everyone was dumbfounded. Only then did they realize that the older and more experienced generals were no longer there. At this time, the people standing in the large tent were all young people under the age of 30. What to do? They couldn't even find someone to ask for advice. After these young generals had left, Yi Li, who was sitting on the side reading, raised her head and asked, "Can these young people do it?" Shuo Jing and Qin Feng, who were standing not far away, looked at each other. They couldn't help but lower their heads and laugh. Every time they heard Wang Fei talk about these young generals, it always made them want to laugh. It was true that these young generals could be called young generals under any circumstances, but even so, most of them were older than Wang Fei by 2 years. Especially since Wang Fei looked younger than her actual age. It was strange for a woman in her 20s to call a group of men in their 20s young people. Mo Xiaoyao said lazily, "A famous sword has to be tempered thousands of times before it can be used. They are still too inexperienced. It is not a bad thing to take more blows. Won't this blow be too big?" Not just these young people, Yi Li and Mo Xiaoyao were also studying the defense of Bien City. Even Mo Xiaoyao himself could not say that a direct attack could open the gates of Bien City. Also, this kind of war of attrition was not suitable for them who had limited military strength deep in Xiling. Mo Xiaoyao did not care. Yes, after they can withstand this blow, they will be able to withstand most of the blows in the future. The pressure of the two famous generals of Xiling was definitely enough. At the same time, he wanted to see if these two were old. Thus, the Mahist army led by a few young people began to attack Bian City every day. But Bian City's watertight defense showed no signs of being shaken. In the last 2 days, the defenders of Bian City simply ignored the provocations from below. As long as there was no one attacking the gates and no one climbing the walls, the defenders above would do what they were supposed to do most of the time. In the face of such a situation, the young generals clearly felt a sense of contempt from the enemy. The enemy was not afraid of them, but simply disdained to pay attention to them. This made the young and vigorous young generals unable to bear it. They simply let people take turns to curse at the bottom of the city. Even Long Yang and Zhu Yan's 8 generations of ancestors were cursed. Hearing this, Mo Xiuyao, who was looking at them from behind, laughed until he fell down. At the same time, the 2 old generals in Bian City were also very happy. These boys are interesting. I like them. They liked them, but others did not like them. Even Lei Tingfeng could not help but anxiously say, General Long, General Zhu, are we just going to let them do as they please? Let them curse like this? Long Yang said lightly, cursing a few words won't cost you anything. It is not your saliva that will be wasted. What are you worried about? But that group of boys cursed very harshly. The generals present silently said in their hearts, if we let them be arrogant like this, will it damage the morale of our army? Lei Tingfeng frowned and asked. Zhu Yan sneered and said, if being cursed by a few words will damage the morale, then what is the point of fighting a war? In addition, if they curse you, can't you curse back? Everyone was different. They were going to fight a war, not a war of words. Long Yang shook his head and sighed. He asked, what do you think of the fighting power of the Mahist army? Lei Tingfeng frowned and said with some doubts, the Mahist army is indeed brave, but they are not as powerful as the legends say. Moreover, although the level of the generals seems to be good, they are not particularly superb. Could it be, they are hiding their strength and want us to relax our vigilance? Long Yang said, in these days, the soldiers who led the attack were all young generals under 30 years old. What are the main generals of the Mahist army doing? Are they hiding in the big tent and sleeping? After listening to Long Yang's words, Lei Tingfeng became even more uneasy. He did notice that in these days, those who attacked the city were all unfamiliar young faces. Not to mention Mo Xiuyao, even the well-known people such as Lu Jingxian and Feng Zhiyao did not even show their faces. What do they want to do? General, please give me some pointers. Chapter 653. Long Yang and Zhu Yan sighed and said, find out as soon as possible whether Mo Xiuyao and Lu Jingxian are still in the Mahist army camp. Not to mention Lei Tingfeng, even they couldn't figure out what Mo Xiuyao wanted to do. If Mo Xiuyao had time to slowly confront them, it was impossible. Even if the Mahist army won all the battles along the way, this was still the land of West Hill. Once the war dragged on for a long time, not to mention Lei Jinting's troops, other reinforcements from other places would gradually come. At that time, the Mahist army would be surrounded by millions of Xiling army. Therefore, the Mahist army could not afford to delay time. It was also impossible to say that there was any other shortcut. Zhu Yan had lived in Bian City for more than 20 years, and no one knew the scenery around Bian City better than him. Bian City was surrounded by flat land, and there was a moat outside the city. There was no other way except for a frontal attack, and it was even more impossible to bypass Bian City. Bian City was located on the east and west main roads. If the Mahist army did not take Bian City, even if they bypassed it, their military supplies would be cut off at any time. Lei Tingfeng felt a chill in his heart and quickly responded, yes, I will immediately send people to check. Waving his hand to let everyone retreat, Zhu Yan sighed tiredly and said, I'm old, I'm old. Long Yang looked at him and smiled, how about it? How does Mo Xiaoyao compare with Mo Lufang? Zhu Yan shook his head and said, it's hard to say. At least Mo Xiaoyao's ability to hide his intentions is better than his father's. At that time, I could at least guess Mo Xiaoyao's thoughts, but now, I really don't understand what Mo Xiaoyao wants to do. Really, I have to admit that I'm old. When he said this, he couldn't help but feel a little more miserable. Wasn't it the saddest thing in the world for a general to have white hair and old beauty? Hearing this, Long Yang couldn't help but feel sad. If it was the young Long Yang, he definitely wouldn't be sitting here and chatting. Back then, he was the god of slaughter of the western regions, and he was always good at taking the initiative to attack instead of passively defending a city. But now, could they still mount their warhorses? Old dragon, can we defend Bian City? He raised his eyes and looked down at the city, looking through the battlements into the distance. In the distance, a dark mass of banners was fluttering in the wind. The murderous aura was oppressive. Although the young people who were clamoring at the city gate were immature, they were full of vigor and fighting spirit that they didn't have. If the two sides were not opposing each other, he could not help but praise such an elite army. For the first time in his life, Zhu Yan asked with uncertainty. Long Yang smiled faintly and said, loyalty in life, loyalty in death. He would do his best. Zhu Yan, this is the first time I've heard that you have no confidence. Zhu Yan shook his head and said with a wry smile, it's probably because I haven't been on the battlefield for too many years. Well, it's enough to be able to fight with the descendants of the Prince Ding mansion in my lifetime. Don't be so discouraged. Don't think that I don't know that you still have an elite army hidden in your hands. Even if Bian City can't be defended, those people are enough to make the Mahist army suffer. Long Yang glanced at him and said lightly. After Zhu Yan was stripped of his military power, he didn't live in seclusion in the mountains like him, nor did he disappear like Feng Ao. Instead, he chose to settle down in a bustling place like Bian City, even at the risk of being monitored by Jinan Palace. It was because he still had an elite army in his hands that others didn't know about. Even Genin of Gojoseon didn't know about it, but Long Yang, who had a close friendship with Emperor Xianwen like Zhu Yan, knew about it. Because when Emperor Xianwen gave this elite army to Zhu Yan, he was next to him. The most important responsibility of this elite army was to guard against the Prince Ding mansion. The late emperor was farsighted. Except for the fact that he couldn't choose an excellent heir, everything about him was enough to be admired. Zhu Yan was stunned, and his white eyebrows gradually wrinkled. Suddenly, he said in a deep voice, oh no. What? Long Yang didn't understand. Zhu Yan said, the Prince Ding mansion must have known about the existence of that elite army. How? Long Yang couldn't help but become serious. This elite army could be said to be the most secretive army in West Hill. Even Genin of Gojoseon, who always monitored Zhu Yan, didn't know about it. How could the Prince Ding mansion know about it? Zhu Yan closed his eyes and said, the Mahist army's attack on West Hill is definitely not accidental. I'm afraid that Mo Xiaoyao has already calculated it. If he had already made up his mind, why didn't he send someone to secretly investigate? You mean, 6 years ago, you and I both thought that Prince Ding would attack West Hill, but in the end, nothing happened. Long Yang's expression changed and said, you mean, since then, Mo Xiaoyao has already been calculating how to take West Hill. At that time, he stopped just because he wasn't ready. Zhu Yan nodded and sighed, now, he is ready. Even Lei Dingfeng didn't know you were in Bian City before he came, but you just heard it. Those young people even scolded you. It shows that they already knew you were in Bian City. Long Yang's wrinkled face was a little paler. Mo Xiuyao didn't intend to attack Bian City at all. He's only surrounding Bian City because he wants to eliminate your elite troops first. Obviously so. Then now, Zhu Yan shook his head and said, now you and I can't go out. We can only resign ourselves to fate. The room was silent for a moment. Long Yang suddenly slammed the table and said angrily, resign ourselves to fate my ass. I've been fighting all my life. If I resigned myself to fate, I would have died long ago. Mo Xiuyao wants to trap us first. I'd like to see who can be trapped by those guys. I don't believe that. A mere 400,000 troops can be used as 1 million. The Mahist army only had 400,000 soldiers and horses no matter how elite they were. Bian City now had 500,000 soldiers and horses, plus more than 100,000 elite soldiers in secret. Their strength was far more than the Mahist army. If they were still trapped in Bian City, they might as well take a sword and slit their own throats. Zhu Yan's eyes flashed. You're right. Come, ask Prince Genom of Gojoseon to come here. Chapter 654. Long Yang and Zhu Yan couldn't help but worry about Mo Xiuyao's intentions. After receiving the news from Leitingfeng that many troops of the Mahist army had secretly left, their worries became a reality. Zhu Yan sat in the chair and was silent for a long time. He sighed and said, well, it's really the Mahist army. Looking at the two old generals' expressions, Leitingfeng also knew that things had changed. He asked worriedly, Old General, what happened? Zhu Yan and Long Yang looked at each other and finally told him what had happened. At this time, it didn't make any sense to hide this kind of thing. After listening to Long Yang and Zhu Yan, Leitingfeng was also shocked. General Zhu, you mean, you still have hundreds of thousands of elite soldiers in your hands? Speaking of this, he couldn't help but look at Long Yang next to him with surprise. In the past 20 years, the Lord of Zhenan's mansion had been carefully monitoring Zhu Yan, who lived in Bian City. In the past 20 years, he had never contacted his former subordinates, and even in Bian City, he rarely went out. Leitingfeng was almost completely at ease with him, but he didn't expect that the other party was actually secretly holding on to an army of more than 100,000 elite soldiers. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and horses looked insignificant in West Hill's total military strength of nearly 3 million and could be increased at any time. But if used on the edge of a knife, it was very terrible. For example, in the past 20 years, his father had come to Bian City several times. If Zhu Yan suddenly attacked at that time, Leitingfeng's heart trembled and he didn't dare to think about it anymore. He finally understood why his father had always been on guard against these old generals. It was said that the civil officials and powerful officials disrupted the government, but the ones who could really change the dynasty and usurp the throne were generally military generals. Without military power, everything was just empty talk. As if he understood what Leitingfeng was thinking, Long Yang snorted and said, this elite army was personally given to Zhu Yan by the late emperor. Even the current emperor has no right to take it back. Why should Zhenan Palace know? What's more, this elite troop was originally prepared to guard against the Prince Ding mansion. Leitingfeng remained silent. He believed Long Yang's words. However, there were some things that couldn't be solved just by believing. But now was not the time to discuss this matter. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers. What's the use of fighting against the Mahist army? Idiot! Zhu Yan snorted and said, the late emperor was wise and far-sighted. He knew that the Mahist army was the biggest enemy of the West Hill. Therefore, he had long prepared a bargaining chip to deal with the Mahist army. If not for the sudden death of the late emperor, how could he have? There was also Enchanting. But they had to admit that it was reasonable for the old general to come out. They could not find a loophole in Bian City's defense. Such a blow made the young general's faces more and more ugly day by day. At this time, Yunting's face was still green. In fact, if Yunting knew that not only him, but even his prince's wife could not find a loophole in Bian City's defense, he would not be so depressed. "Look, are they coming out?" Chen Yun pointed to the fluttering flag on the wall. Obviously, there were people and horses moving very quickly. Yunting's eyes narrowed, and a sneer appeared on his young face. "Zhu Yan. Brothers," continued to scold him. The Mahist army behind him once again loudly greeted Zhu Yan's 8 generations of ancestors and relatives. Long Yang led people to appear on the wall, squinting at the young man who was showing off under the city wall. He smiled and said, "Young man, tell me your name." Yunting said proudly, "I am Yunting, the Deputy General of the Eagle Army of the Mahist Army's 9th Division." Long Yang was stunned. Such an obviously different organization from the General Army made him unable to determine Yunting's identity for a while. But from Yunting's age, he could guess a thing or two. Such a young and high-spirited young man, 80% could not be the general of an army. He looked at Yunting with a smile and said, "Where is the general of the Mahist army? Or is there no one in the Mahist army?" Yunting was not happy. He looked up at the old man on the wall and said, "I am the general. It's just Bian City, I don't need to trouble others. I will let you see the ability of the Mahist army." Long Yang was not angry, as if he was looking at an ignorant child. He smiled and said, "What? Then let me see the ability of the young general of the Mahist army." "An. I am not Zhu Yan." Long Yang. Yunting gnashed his teeth. Chapter 655. Indeed, the older, the wiser. Yunting was already at a disadvantage even before the battle started. They had only exchanged a few words. Below the city tower, the originally closed city gate suddenly opened, and the drawbridge over the moat was lowered. The West Hills soldiers who had been hiding in the city rushed out like a tide towards the Mahist army. These days, not only were the Mahist army soldiers sullen, but also the soldiers brought by Lei Tingfeng as reinforcements. Being insulted by the enemy without being able to charge down and kill them was the greatest humiliation as a soldier. Now that they could finally leave the city, these soldiers naturally rushed towards the Mahist army soldiers who had been showing off in front of them for the past few days. The battle was on the verge of breaking out. For a moment, the sound of war drums and killing filled the sky outside the city. On the city tower, Long Yang calmly looked at the killing below the city. Whether it was the Mahist army or the Shilling army, their fighting power could be said to be quite good. Therefore, when the strong met, the killing was naturally very intense. Long Yang looked at the young white-robed general below the city with a faint smile. He raised his hand and waved the small red flag in his hand. The West Hills soldiers in gray armor quickly changed their formation under the guidance of the flag. Standing on the city tower, they could clearly see the entire battlefield. The Black Missouri family army camp was quickly surrounded and split apart by the gray tide of people, before being destroyed one by one. Yunting's reaction was not slow. He also ordered the formation as quickly as possible. However, he was still one step behind Long Yang. The Shilling army's formation changed again. Like a gray dragon, it was wantonly killing the Mahist army. Although the Mahist army was brave, the battlefield was not something that could be solved by a single soldier's bravery. When a Mahist army soldier faced 3 West Hills soldiers at the same time, when a small team of Mahist army soldiers was surrounded by a large team of West Hills soldiers, Yunting could only watch as the soldiers around him fell one by one in front of him. He abruptly turned around and saw the white-clothed old man standing on the city wall. He was dressed in plain clothes and looked like an inconspicuous villager. However, the confidence and arrogance in the old man's eyes revealed that he was not an ordinary person. Enchanting shouldn't have been able to see the other party's expression from such a distance. However, Enchanting clearly felt that he was as insignificant as an ant in the other party's eyes. Enchanting. What are you doing? Charge out. Chen Yun kicked away the stunned Enchanting. An arrow narrowly missed the spot where Enchanting was originally standing. Chen Yun glared at him in annoyance. How dare you daydream on the battlefield? You must be tired of living. Enchanting came back to his senses. At that moment, he was so intimidated by Long Yang's aura that he forgot that he was on the battlefield. Enchanting dodged the sword that came slashing at him. Cold sweat dripped down his forehead. This was the true power of the god of slaughter of the western region. The sound of the retreat was heard from behind. The Mahist army no longer lingered in the battle and broke through the Shilling army's encirclement to kill their way out. However, the Mahist army retreated in a sorry state that they had never been in for many years. On the city wall, Long Yang also signaled for the retreat of the Mahist army after seeing them retreat. Lei Tingfeng frowned and said, "General, why don't we pursue them?" Long Yang said calmly, "Today was just a test. It seems that the Mahist army has indeed split up. Just now, the Mahist army was about to be defeated, but no one came to help. Instead, they retreated. Then, don't worry. We'll test them again tomorrow," Long Yang said in a low voice. After losing the battle, Enchanting and his men returned to the camp dejectedly and prepared to ask for forgiveness from the prince's consort. However, Jing, who was guarding outside the tent, told him that the prince's consort had something to do. All the military affairs were temporarily handed over to Chen Yun and Enchanting. Enchanting was so frightened that he almost fell to the ground. Chen Yun, who was behind him, was also pale. It was not that they looked down on themselves, but with their experience, they were not even qualified to command an army. How could they command the entire Mahist army? The two of them looked at each other and broke out in cold sweat. Enchanting looked at Jing for help. Jing shrugged and patted Enchanting's shoulder helplessly. "Since the prince ordered you to do so, it means that he trusts your abilities. Don't worry." But we just lost the battle," Enchanting said shamefully. He had thought that he would be punished by military law for not completing the task given by the prince. But in the current situation, it would be better to be punished by military law. Jing smiled calmly. "You almost lost just now. You haven't lost yet, have you?" He gave the two of them a look that said, "I have faith in you." Jing turned and went back to the battle. Enchanting wanted to cry but had no tears. "If you hadn't retreated just now, I might have died on the battlefield." 100 miles southwest of Bian City was a small county town. The entire county town was less than 1/10 the size of Bian City, but its location was on the official road between the city of the Emperor of Shilling and Bian City. In other words, if the troops from the west wanted to reach Bian City as quickly as possible, they would have to pass through here. 3 days ago, Zhang Qilan was ordered by Mo Xiuyao to lead 70,000 troops to occupy this small town. Because Shiling's main defense was Bian City, such a small town's military strength was naturally weak. Zhang Qilan almost effortlessly took over this small town. Then the 70,000 troops were stationed in this small town, seemingly doing nothing. But Zhang Qilan knew that there was a group of more than 100,000 elite troops nearby. Even though the Mahist army had sent out their most elite troops, Qilin, they still couldn't find their specific location. But Zhang Qilan knew that they were hiding in the mountains about 30 miles away. It wasn't wise for the Mahist army to enter the mountains with their military strength, so Zhang Qilan waited here. If this group of troops wanted to approach Bian City, they would have to pass by him. He wasn't in a hurry. Not far from the small town, on a small road that deviated from the official road, a group of Mahist army soldiers were chasing a group of people. There were only 5 people in this group. 4 men were protecting a young girl in plain clothes as they fought and retreated. Although the 4 men were skilled, there were too many soldiers chasing them. Moreover, the Mahist army soldiers weren't ordinary people. The 4 of them were already covered in wounds, but they didn't forget to protect the young girl in the middle. "Miss, hurry and leave. We'll block them. Go to the capital to find." One of the men used force to push the young girl towards the narrow road in front of them. Unfortunately, before he could finish his words, he was stabbed in the abdomen and fell to the ground. The remaining 3 didn't have time to look at their companions. One of them pulled the young girl and ran forward, while the other 2 stayed behind to block the Mahist army soldiers chasing them. The 2 of them ran wildly. Unfortunately, they didn't run far before the young girl fell to the ground, gasping for breath. "I can't walk anymore, you guys go." "No. Miss, hurry and leave. You must return to the capital. Don't forget, the general wants you to live well." The guard said sternly, pulling the young girl towards the side of the road into the forest. Not long after, the footsteps of the soldiers chasing them could be heard. It was obvious that the 2 guards who stayed behind had died in battle. Chapter 656. The 2 of them hid in the thistles and thorns in the forest, and the pursuing soldiers found that they had lost track of them. Some of them searched for nearly an hour, using their swords and spears to randomly stab and hack at the thorny bushes that could hide people. In the end, they still couldn't find any trace of the 2 people. Only then did they gradually leave, taking the bodies of the dead guards back to receive their rewards. The forest gradually quieted down, and after a long time, the thistles and bushes on the side of the road moved. A young girl in a sorry state crawled out from the bushes and pushed the person beside her. "Wake up! Wake up!" Her slender white hands were covered in blood, and the young girl was so frightened that she immediately cried out. It turned out that when the soldiers were searching, the guard used his body to block the swords that were slashing at the bushes. There was a long wound on his back that was continuously bleeding, and he had already fallen unconscious. The pale young girl looked at the desolate wilderness in front of her and the only person she could rely on who was unconscious. She finally could not help but cry. In the midst of her drowsy crying, she vaguely saw a moon-white figure appear in front of her. The young girl raised her head in confusion. "Save me!" The young man wearing moon-white clothes silently looked at the man and woman who had already fainted in front of him, a pair of sword-like eyebrows on his handsome face slightly wrinkled. He lowered his head to look at the man's injuries. The numerous wounds on his body and the almost fatal stab on his back were enough to show that the man had experienced a difficult battle. Although the young girl was wearing ordinary cotton clothes, her beautiful face and slender hands were enough to show that she should have been pampered and spoiled since childhood. Originally, he could have saved them, and even the guards who had died, he could have saved them. But his special identity meant that he had to think twice before he acted, so he had been secretly watching the guards die one by one, watching the young girl cry helplessly in the wilderness. "Young master, what should we do?" The guard following behind him asked in a low voice. The man was silent for a moment, and then said, "I just heard the guard say something about a general." "Which general's daughter is she?" The guard shook his head and said, "This subordinate does not know. Presumably, she is the daughter of a general who was defeated by the Mahist army." The man thought for a moment and said, "See if they have any tokens on them." The guard stepped forward and squatted down. Very quickly, he found a piece of cloth from the unconscious guard's body. Then, he took a purple jade bracelet from the girl's wrist and respectfully handed it to the handsome man in white. The man took it and looked at it. He frowned and said, it's the imperial bodyguard of the Tiger General, Yang Hu. This purple jade bracelet was a tribute from the western regions during the previous emperor's reign. The previous emperor bestowed it to the Grand Preceptor. Lord Ling Hui's wife is Lord Ling's daughter. The guard said in a low voice, "So, this lady is the daughter of the Hui general." General Hui, who was stationed in Li City, had passed away 10 days ago. This girl. The man pondered for a long time before finally saying, "Bring him back." In the hidden depths of the mountains, there were many courtyards and houses. Under the cover of the dense forest and perennial clouds, it was almost impossible for outsiders to find any trace of it. In a simple and crude room, a sleeping girl seemed to have suddenly woken up from a nightmare and sat down abruptly. Then, she saw a handsome young man sitting not far away from her. "Ah! Save!" "Shut up," the young man said in a low voice. The girl hid in the innermost part of the bed in fear and wrapped herself tightly in the blanket. Who are you?" The young man said in a low voice, "I should be the one asking you that. Who are you?" The girl bit her red lips and refused to speak. "Where did Lin go?" He's still." The girl trembled, as if she did not dare to continue asking. The man said calmly, "He's still alive, if that's what you want to ask." Hearing this, the girl sighed in relief. That's good. You saved us." The man did not deny it. Instead, he asked lightly, "Who are you?" My name is Yang Xianya. My father is the Tiger General." My father. As she spoke, the girl's eyes reddened. Crystal clear tears fell from the corners of her eyes, and she slowly sobbed. The man frowned slightly and sighed. "I know, the Tiger General died in battle 10 days ago. Did he ask the guards to escort you out?" The girl, Yang Xianya, nodded. She bit her lips and said in a low voice, "Before Li City fell, my father had already asked people to escort me back to the capital. Originally, there were 12 of them. But now, there's only Lin left." The man frowned and thought for a moment before asking, "Why did the Mahist army pursue you so relentlessly?" Although she was the daughter of the Tiger General, she was not that important to the Mahist army. This kind of relentless pursuit was very unreasonable. The girl shook her head in confusion. "I don't know. My father only told me to go back to the capital to find my uncle." The man stood up and said, "I understand. Rest well. When you're better, I'll send someone to escort you back to the capital." Then, he turned and walked out. "You. Xianya still doesn't know your name. I'll definitely repay you for saving my life when I return to the capital," the girl said in a low voice. The man paused and said lightly, "Zhu Ling." When the man went out, the guards were already waiting outside. When they saw him come out, they quickly greeted him. "Young master, we've already checked. The late Grand Tutor Ling's daughter married the Tiger General and had only one daughter. General Yang and his wife loved this daughter very much. It's not an exaggeration to say that they doted on her. Now, Lord Ling, who is Miss Yang's uncle, also treats this niece as his own. It's said that Miss Yang is 17 this year and has been engaged to her cousin, the Ling family's eldest son, since she was young. If it weren't for the sudden attack from the northwest, General Yang would have brought his daughter back to the capital to hold the wedding." The man nodded. "I've already asked, and it's pretty much the same as what you said." The guard asked, "Then, can her words be trusted?" Zhu Ling said, "Let her stay first. Grandfather has a good relationship with the Ling family. If she's really the Ling family's granddaughter and we don't save her, we won't be able to explain it to the Ling family. Send someone to watch over them." "Yes, young master." Chapter 657. The mountains were shrouded in clouds and mist all year round, so it was rare to see direct sunlight even on normal days. Thus, in the Western Hill, where most of the land was relatively dry, this mountain range was a rare moist and green place. At the entrance of the small courtyard, a delicate and pale girl was stopped before she could reach the door. "Who is it?" Young Shania was startled and said with some trepidation, I want to check on all Lin's injuries." The guard standing at the entrance of the courtyard was expressionless, as if he was not moved by the weak girl in front of him. "Young master has instructed Miss to recuperate in the courtyard. Guard Lin will naturally come and meet Miss when he has recovered." Young Shania bit her lips and said in a low voice, "But I'm very worried. Woo-woo. I don't know anyone around me. Only him. I beg you, let me go see him." Seeing the girl crying pitifully in front of them, the two guards were somewhat hesitant. After all, the young master had brought her back and ordered them to take good care of her. "Miss, please wait. We will go and report to the young master." In the end, the guards could only compromise. What happened? Young Shania was about to thank them when Zhu Ling's voice came from outside the door. The guards hurriedly bowed and stood side by side. Young Shania was about to explain what happened to her guard. Zhu Ling raised his eyebrows and looked at the pale girl with a trace of panic in front of him, deep in thought. Young Shania asked carefully, "Young Master Zhu, how is all Lin's injuries? When can we return to the capital?" "Zhu Gongzi, please send someone to escort the two of us back to the capital. When we return to the capital, my daughter and the Ling family will be grateful to you." Zhu Ling's eyes flashed and he looked at Yang Xianya with a gentler expression. He smiled faintly and said, "Don't worry, Miss Yang. When you recover, I will send someone to escort you back to the capital. However, Guard Lin's injuries are not light. I'm afraid he will have to lie down for a few days." Young Xianya sighed in relief and nodded, "Thank you, young Master Zhu. It's good that all Lin is fine. May I go see him?" Zhu Ling smiled. "Miss Yang can just look at him from the door. It's best not to look at his injuries. This one has already sent someone back to the capital to deliver a letter to young Master Ling. Perhaps it won't be long before young Master Ling personally comes to pick up Miss Yang." Hearing this, young Xianya showed a trace of joy and relief. "That's great, thank you, young Master Zhu. Young Master Zhu is indeed a good person." Zhu Ling smiled faintly, "Not at all, Miss Yang is the descendant of valiant bravery. These matters are only a small matter for this one." After comforting young Xianya, who was worried about the guards, and sending her back to her room, Zhu Ling left the small courtyard and went to the outer courtyard. Although this courtyard built in the middle of the mountain forest was particularly simple compared to other courtyards in the city, it still had two entrances, and the study was in the corner of the outer courtyard. After entering the study, the guard behind him said, "Young master, it seems that this Miss Yang is indeed the daughter of the Hu Wei general. Just now, young master said that young Master Ling was coming, but I didn't see her acting strangely." Zhu Ling nodded and sat down behind the desk. He said tiredly, "This is a special period. It is always good to be careful. Has the guard called of Lin woken up?" The guard nodded and said, "He just woke up not long ago. His injuries are too serious. The knife on his back almost took his life." The situation he described is similar to what Miss Yang said. When the Mahist army first entered Li City, General Yang arranged for more than 10 people to escort Miss Yang back to the capital to join the Ling family. However, they didn't expect the Mahist army to attack the city so quickly. They had just left Li City when the city fell. When they disguised themselves as normal people and passed by the small county that Zhang Qilan took over, they accidentally exposed their identities and were chased by the Mahist army. Zhu Ling frowned and nodded. It seems that this of Lin is still loyal. Have the doctor use the best medicine and heal his injuries as soon as possible. Yes, young master. Is there any news from grandfather? Changing the topic, Zhu Ling asked about serious matters. The guard's expression also became more worried. He shook his head and said, "No, ever since Bian City was surrounded by the Mahist army, there has been no news from the old general. Zhang Qilan is guarding the county, and anyone who goes in and out has to go through strict checks. I'm afraid that even if the old general wanted to send a letter, he wouldn't be able to. Young master, are we going to hide here forever? Are we going to let Zhang Qilan occupy the main road in and out of Bian City? Although Bian City has abundant reserves, if it is continuously surrounded for 1 or 2 months, it will still be a bit difficult." Zhu Ling thought for a moment and shook his head. "No, Mo Xiaoyao won't do that. He is in a hurry. After 1 or 2 months, the reinforcements from all over Xiling will be able to reach Bian City. At that time, his mere 400,000 soldiers, no matter how powerful they are, will be like a dragon in shallow water or a tiger in the plains." "Young master, you mean?" Zhu Ling frowned and said, "Mo Xiaoyao doesn't have many soldiers to begin with. At this time, he can still divide tens of thousands of soldiers to occupy a small county. I suspect he already knows of our existence." The guard was also shocked and said, "Prince Ding sent Zhang Qilan to guard Bian City to prevent us from reinforcing Bian City and outflanking him." Chapter 658. Zhu Ling looked at the girl who was deep in thought and said lightly, "Come in." The person outside the door came in and looked at Yang Xianya with some hesitation. Yang Xianya stood up and said, "Young master, Xianya will leave first. We can continue the game in the future. I'll go see Ah Lin." Zhu Ling's eyes were gentle as he nodded, "That's good. Guard Lin will be able to get out of bed in a few days. You don't have to worry." "I know. Thank you, young master." Yang Xianya thanked Zhu Ling again before leaving. Watching the girl's slender figure disappear at the door, Zhu Ling looked down at the unfinished game in front of him, lost in thought. "Young master." The guard in front of him called out with some confusion. Zhu Ling came back to his senses and asked, "What happened?" The guard said, "These days, the Mahist army has surrounded Bian City, but they haven't carried out a large-scale attack. Instead, they've only sent a few small generals to shout outside the city and casually fight for a while before retreating back to the camp. In the Mahist army, there hasn't been a single general under Mo Xiaoyao who can take charge of an area. In addition, when the two armies were fighting yesterday, the old general led 70,000 men out of the city and came to our side. I'm afraid he wants to deal with Zhang Qilan first." Zhu Ling was startled and frowned. The generals under Mo Xiaoyao didn't appear on the battlefield. "But, there's only one Zhang Qilan here. Where did the others go?" The guard said, "The Mahist army secretly took some men out of the camp. The old general suspects that the Mahist army already knows of our existence. They plan to surround Bian City on the surface, but concentrate most of their forces to deal with us. I'm afraid the old general is worried, so he came to help us." Zhu Ling closed his eyes. "Who's guarding Bian City?" "General Long Yang is also in Bian City." "That's good." "No, that's not right. Mo Xiaoyao doesn't want to deal with us. He wants to lure grandfather out of the city." Suddenly thinking of something, Zhu Ling's face changed and he stood up abruptly. Mo Xiaoyao didn't appear in the Mahist army camp, nor is he with Zhang Qilan. It must be hidden somewhere else. If we don't show up, he won't be able to find us. He wants to lure grandfather out of the city, and then slowly deplete Bian City's military strength. Hearing this, the guard's expression changed greatly. Then, "Young master, what should we do?" Zhu Ling said solemnly, "Pass down the order, send troops to attack Zhang Qilan's forces. We must take down the county town before tomorrow morning so that we can help grandfather. This subordinate will go right away. Deep into the night, the quiet mountains seemed especially quiet tonight. In the courtyard hidden in the night, a slender figure briskly swept out. She avoided the night patrol guards and nimbly entered the secret study in the corner of the front yard. Even tonight, most of the soldiers in the forest had left, but the outside of the study was still heavily guarded. Shadow approached silently like a phantom. By the time the 4 guards outside the door reacted, 3 of them had already fallen to the ground. "It's you. You." Whoosh. A dagger flew out and nailed itself into the heart of the last person. "Lin Han," Shadow said in a low voice. Under the eaves, a tall and straight voice quietly fell. He walked over and looked at the 4 corpses on the ground without the slightest ripple in his eyes. "Princess." The person who came was the guard of the Huwei general's manor, Ah Lin, who was supposed to be lying on the bed and unable to get up. "Is the injury serious?" Young Xianya, Yi Li, asked softly. Lin Han said in a low voice, "It avoided the vital parts, so it's not serious." "It just looks serious." Yi Li nodded. "It's good that you're fine. Watch me, I'll go in and take a look." "Yes." Yi Li entered the study and came out after a while. Soon, the 2 figures disappeared from the courtyard. Not long after, a dazzling firework broke through the heavy fog and the night, blooming in the night sky of the mountains. When the sky was about to brighten, the battle in the small county town officially began. This small town was not as sturdy as Bian City. The height and thickness of the city walls were far less than Bian City. There were even some places that didn't have city walls at all. It was much more difficult to defend such a small town than to enter the palace. Therefore, Zhu Ling and his men almost didn't encounter much resistance and attacked the city. They fought fiercely with the generals of the Mahist army in the city. In a hidden corner of the city, Zhang Qilan stood on a high place with his subordinates and watched the battle in the city. His subordinate whispered, "General, the other side is estimated to have nearly 100,000 people. We should withdraw." Zhang Qilan shook his head and said, "No, according to the information given to us by the princess, the other side has at least 180,000 people. But this county town is too small. Hundreds of thousands of people can't be used at all. It's impossible for the other side to bring out all their forces." The general whispered. Zhang Qilan glanced at him angrily and said, "Of course, I know this. Don't you see that there are less than 100,000 people and there's almost no space left? Tell the boys on the periphery to secretly withdraw. Those who have joined the battle, fight for me. Delay them. We must delay until Zhu Yan's men arrive." Hearing this, the general said with a bitter face, "If so, we really have no way to survive. Hundreds of thousands of people were enough for them. How could they survive if tens of thousands of people and an old general who had been on the battlefield came?" Zhang Qilan patted his subordinate's shoulder with a smile and said, "Are you afraid? Don't be afraid. I'm with you. Even if there's no way to survive, we can drag a famous general of West Hill down with us. It's not a loss." The general stared and said loudly, "Who's afraid? I don't want to be buried with Zhu Yan. I want to follow the prince to conquer the world." Zhang Qilan laughed and said, "It's good that you have this courage. I think highly of you." Ha! While they were talking, flames appeared in the east outside the city. Zhang Qilan took a deep breath and said, "They're coming." Zhu Yan came so fast that they had just seen the torches and rushed to the city gate. The gate of the small county town was vulnerable. The Mahist army didn't have so many soldiers to defend the city tower. Not long after, the east gate was broken by the soldiers of West Hill. The Mahist army was sandwiched in the middle by the enemy from the west and the east. Zhang Qilan looked at the bright sky and said with some regret, "It's time to retreat." When the golden horn sounded, the Mahist army did not have the slightest desire to fight and left quickly. The soldiers of West Hill had been sullen these days. Seeing the Mahist army fleeing, they wanted to go forward and chase after them. But they were stopped by Zhu Yan. "Don't chase. There may be a trap ahead," Zhu Ling said. Zhu Yan nodded and said, "Yes. The Mahist army's retreat seems to be chaotic, but there's order in the chaos. It's not a sign of defeat. I'm afraid that they want to lure us in." After ordering the soldiers to clean up the battlefield, Zhu Ling and Zhu Yan had time to talk alone. Because of Zhu Yan's identity and Zhu Ling's heavy responsibility, Zhu Ling stayed in the mountains all year round. Therefore, Zhu Ling and Zhu Yan rarely saw each other. The last time they saw each other was more than half a year ago. Looking at his grandson who stood tall and firm in front of him, Zhu Yan nodded with relief. At the same time, he felt very guilty for his grandson. In order to take charge of the army for him, his grandson could only stay in the mountains all year round. This child was his only relative, and also his most beloved junior. Sometimes Zhu Yan even wondered if everything he had insisted on was worth it. Chapter 659. Good boy, thank you for your hard work. Looking at Zhu Ling, Zhu Yan whispered after a long time. Zhu Ling smiled faintly and said, "Grandfather, you are too serious. This is what I should do. By the way, why did grandfather take the army out of the city? The defense of Bian City." Zhu Yan waved his hand and said, "No, Mo Xiuyao wants to lure me out. But Longyang is in Bian City, so it doesn't matter if I am there or not. But your side. I don't know why I am always a little worried. Especially these 2 days, I always feel frightened when I think about it. What's the matter on your side?" Zhu Ling shook his head and said, "I am fine. Grandfather, you are too worried. His grandson will be careful in everything. Since grandfather came out, there is also a benefit. We can stay here and cooperate with General Longyang to restrict the speed of the Mahist army's attack. What's more, we have more than 600,000 troops on both sides. Mo Xiuyao has less than 400,000 troops. Are we afraid of him?" Zhu Ling would not ignore his grandfather's worry. It was not the general suspicion of the old man, but the instinctive premonition of danger of an old general. Zhu Yan patted his grandson's shoulder and said, "Good boy, you have grown up." In the face of his grandfather's praise, even the calm Zhu Ling could not help but smile. The grandfather and grandson sat down and exchanged views on the current situation. Zhu Yan was even more happy about his grandson's growth. When Zhu Yan said that he saved Yang Xianya, Zhu Yan frowned and said, "You said that she is the daughter of the late Hui general. Are you sure?" Zhu Ling was stunned and said, "Of course I am sure. She has a lot of tokens and the waist tokens of the guards around her. In addition, I asked her a lot about Hui general and the Ling family, and there were no flaws." Suddenly there was a bad feeling in his heart. Zhu Ling's face changed slightly and he looked at Zhu Yan uneasily. Zhu Yan frowned and said, "You are right. That girl's temperament and appearance are a bit like Hui general's daughter. But, 2 years ago, when Hui general took his wife and daughter to Li City, he visited me in Bian City. The girl of the Yang family has been spoiled since childhood, and her temperament is like Hui general. She doesn't like music, chess, calligraphy, and painting. Other than needlework, which was slightly better, she only knew a few words. I don't even know how to play chess." Then, Zhu Ling's expression immediately turned ugly. In the beginning, he was also on guard against Yang Xianya. Even now, he didn't let her know anything important. But after several probing, he really recognized Yang Xinya's identity. Now that he suddenly found out that the other party's identity was a scam, the anger in his heart could be imagined. Grandfather. I have to go back immediately. I'm afraid. Zhu Yan's expression also became dignified. At this time, a woman of unknown origin who claimed to be the daughter of General Hui suddenly appeared. How could he not feel uneasy? After thinking for a while, Zhu Yan nodded and said, "Okay, go ahead. Be careful." "Yes, grandfather, you too, old general, young master. We've been surrounded by the Mahist army." The soldier outside hurried in and reported. In fact, even if he didn't report, Zhu Yan and Zhu Ling already knew. Before his voice died away, there was a deafening sound of war drums outside the city. The two hurried out and climbed up the tower. They saw the flags fluttering under the city. The Mahist army soldiers were holding weapons and waiting for battle. The formation was solemn, and they didn't look like they fled half an hour ago. In front of the army, Zhang Qilan stood straight and laughed loudly. "Old General Zhu." "I, Zhang Qilan, the commander of the Mahist army's Eagle Army, have long heard of old General Zhu's name. Please enlighten me." Zhu Yan looked around. The black mass of the Mahist army in front of him had at least hundreds of thousands of people. Zhang Qilan wasn't an inexperienced general like Yunting and Qin Yun. With a wave of his hand, the soldiers of the Mo family army scattered in all directions. Although it looked like a mess, if one were to look closely, they would be able to see the profoundness behind it. If ordinary generals rashly entered the formation of chaotic heaven, they wouldn't be able to rush out without a considerable number of soldiers. Zhu Ling's expression changed slightly. Apparently, he also saw the beauty of this formation. He said to Zhu Yan, "Grandfather, I'll go and have a try." Zhu Yan nodded and said, "Zhang Qilan is an old general of the Mahist army. Be careful." "I understand." The city gate was opened, and the soldiers of West Hill rushed out. A young man in a moon-white robe didn't have time to change into a battle robe. He directly jumped from the tower to the horse that rushed out of the city gate. He kicked the horse's abdomen and rushed toward the Mahist army. With Zhu Ling in the lead, the soldiers of West Hill rampaged through the Mahist army like a dragon. They were invincible. But they couldn't rush out of the black net of the Mahist army. Behind them, Zhang Qilan, who was riding on horseback and watching the battle, touched his chin and smiled. "This guy is a bit interesting." Behind him, his subordinate reminded him, "General, you are not his opponent." Zhang Qilan's face suddenly darkened. He was not a fool. Marching to war and fighting alone were two different things. Therefore, Zhang Qilan, who grew up in the military camp, naturally knew that there would always be someone stronger than him. It wasn't shameful that he couldn't defeat a kid who was younger than him, but it wasn't pleasant to hear his subordinate say it out loud. He glared at his subordinate angrily. "You talk too much." The subordinate helplessly rolled his eyes. Chapter 660. On the battlefield, Zhu Ling was invincible. The soldiers of the Mahist army could not sit still. Although Zhang Qilan knew that he was no match for Zhu Ling, he did not want to see Zhu Ling being so arrogant in front of him. "Who is this guy?" Zhang Qilan frowned and asked. Qin Feng smiled and said, "He should be a descendant of Zhu Yan, probably a grandson." "I heard that Zhu Yan had a grandson, but he was weak and sickly since he was 10 years old. No one has seen him since. Many people guessed that he died young. Now it seems that he is the one." Zhang Qilan nodded and said, "No wonder. The grandson of General Jingtian is really something." "Commander Qin, sorry to trouble you." Qilin's leader insisted on following him to defend the city. "Wasn't this the purpose?" Qin Feng gave a rare grin. With a pull of the reins, the well-trained warhorse whinnied and charged towards the man in moon-white clothes on the battlefield. In the fierce battle, Zhu Ling had already noticed that someone was rushing toward him. He waved away the enemy beside him and turned around to face the enemy, just in time to meet Qin Feng face to face. Qin Feng raised his eyebrows slightly and waved his long sword toward Zhu Ling's face. Zhu Ling dodged sideways on the horse and raised his long sword to fight back. The two of them fought back and forth on the horse. But they both used swords, and the length of the long sword was limited. It was not convenient to fight on the horse. After dozens of rounds, the two of them jumped off the horse and landed on the battlefield. Zhu Ling shook the long sword in his hand and pointed it at Qin Feng's face. "Who are you? Tell me your name." Qin Feng smiled and said, "I am Qin Feng from the Prince Ding mansion." "Who are you?" Zhu Ling frowned slightly. His words were no different from not saying anything. But he still replied coldly, "I am Zhu Ling, the commander of the Jingwa army in Weiling." Qin Feng smiled and said, "So you are the descendant of General Zhu. Nice to meet you." Zhu Ling snorted. The two of them stopped talking and started fighting again. When Zhang Qilan saw that Zhu Ling was being held back by Qin Feng, he was instantly in a good mood. He nodded repeatedly and said, "Wang Fei was right to see Qin Feng stay behind. Wang Fei is indeed farsighted. This general is far inferior. If it weren't for Qin Feng, this Zhu Ling would not be easy to deal with." Therefore, the interference of these martial arts experts on the battlefield was the most annoying. If he ignored them, the lethality of these experts was several times or even dozens of times stronger than ordinary soldiers. If he sent out a general to fight with them, it would be a huge loss if he lost a general who could lead troops in battle because of a Jianghu expert. Zhang Qilan decided that in the future, she would borrow a few qilin from Wang Fei for every battle. Zhang Qilan was overjoyed. Zhu Yan, on the city wall, was not happy. As soon as Zhu Ling was held back, the formation of the West Hill soldiers behind him was immediately in chaos. The Mahist army took the opportunity to kill. In just a moment, more than half of the West Hill soldiers were lost. Qin Feng and Zhu Ling fought very happily. Although there were many martial arts experts in the Prince Ding mansion, they were all familiar with each other, so it was not interesting to fight. And Qin Feng did not have the courage to challenge a martial arts expert like Prince Ding for the time being. Therefore, it was rare to meet an unfamiliar martial arts expert like Zhu Ling naturally. He was in high spirits to fight with him. Zhu Ling, who was his opponent, was complaining in his heart. He did not expect that with his skills, he would be held back by an unknown young general in the Mahist army for so long. Originally, he just wanted to kill Qin Feng as soon as possible to establish his authority. But now the fight was not over. He was already riding a tiger and could not get off. If Qin Feng did not stop, he would not be able to stop unilaterally. In this fight, he also found that Qin Feng's skills were not worse than his. If it went on like this, it was inevitable that both sides would be hurt. Then, Qin Feng could afford to be hurt, but Zhu Ling could not afford to be hurt. He was the commander of the Jingwa army, and his grandfather, Zhu Yan, was old and could not lead the army to charge and break through the enemy lines. As a result, Zhu Ling was more impatient and less calm. Qin Feng seized the opportunity to launch a series of fierce attacks. He was flustered and was almost seriously injured. On the city wall, Zhu Yan frowned as he watched Zhu Ling fighting with Qin Feng. He signaled the soldiers around him to retreat. As soon as the horn sounded, the West Hill soldiers quickly retreated into the city gate. Zhang Qilan did not let people chase after them. The city gate of this small city was easy to open, but the nearly 200,000 Shilling army in the city gate was not so easy to deal with. If they fought with the Shilling army after entering the city, the Mahist army would not be willing to accept too many casualties. Qin Feng did not want to continue fighting. He generously retreated a distance and let Zhu Ling go back to the city. Then he mounted his horse and returned to the Mahist army. How was it? Zhang Qilan asked. Qin Feng's face was full of satisfaction. He nodded and praised, Master, General Zhang, you'd better not rashly confront him. Zhang Qilan curled his lips and muttered discontentedly, I know, I'm not tired of living. You boy, can you tell me now? Where did the princess go? Don't think that Zhang Qilan was careless because he was careless. It was said that the princess, who came to support them, did not show up from beginning to end. How could Zhang Qilan not be anxious? Looking at the situation, even Wang Yi did not know where Wang Fei had run off to. If His Highness knew about this, wouldn't he skin him alive? General Zhang, calm down. Qin Feng comforted him. Didn't I say that I have sent people to pick up the princess? Zhang Qilan rolled his eyes at him angrily. You might as well not say it. It was to the point that she needed people to pick her up. Obviously, the place where the princess went was not so safe. Taking a deep breath, Zhang Qilan suppressed the impulse to throw this man out. What can we do? Qin Feng thought for a while and said, wait for the princess's signal, and then encircle and destroy the enemy with Feng San. Isn't Feng San in the camp? Where did he come from? Zhang Qilan roared. Qin Feng looked calm. Heaven's secret can't be revealed. This. General, do you understand? I don't understand. Less than a quarter of an hour after the two armies retreated, thick smoke suddenly rose from the mountains in the southwest. It was a good day with no clouds in the sky. The fog that usually lingered in the mountains also dissipated a lot. Even if they were dozens of miles away, they could see it clearly. Seeing this, Zhu Ling and Zhu Yan were shocked. Grandfather. In the mountains. There were not only hundreds of thousands of elite soldiers hidden in the mountains, but also enough food for 200,000 soldiers to eat for a year. Zhu Yan naturally knew this. His old face looked gloomy. Take the soldiers back. But grandfather, here. Zhu Ling said anxiously. Zhu Yan interrupted him. Don't say more. If the camp is taken by the Mahist army, we will be trapped in the city. The food can't support us for a few days. This small city was not a big city like Bian City. Even if the Mahist army did not attack, the Mahist army could encircle the city for 3 to 5 months. With an army of over 100,000 soldiers, it would only take 3 to 5 days for them to finish off all the food in this small city. At that time, they could only wait for the Mahist army to come and clean them up with hunger. The Mahist army won't have so many people. There are definitely no more than 30,000 people over there. Take the soldiers back. No matter what, you must stabilize there. Zhu Yan ordered. The path in the mountains was narrow, and the soldiers in front of them passed through safely without any incident. Just as everyone was about to relax, a loud sound rang out from the mountains. People were shocked to see a huge rock being pushed down from the top of the mountain by something. Then, there was a rumbling sound all around, and countless rocks rolled down from the sides of the hill. Soon, the path forward and backward was blocked. Needless to say, the wails and cries for help from the countless soldiers who were smashed by the rocks instantly resounded throughout the entire forest. Soon, countless torches were lit on both sides of the mountain. In an instant, they lit up the dark forest like 2 dazzling dragons. Some of the West Hill soldiers trapped in the valley cried out in panic, and some had already counterattacked. But the other side was on high ground, and the Mahist army's archery was famous in all countries. For a moment, the valley was filled with the thick smell of blood. Zhu Ling stood silently in the midst of the chaos. The bodyguards around him loyally deflected the arrows that were shot at him. His handsome face was filled with malice and anger in the flickering light of the fire, but he was powerless in the face of the rain of arrows pouring down from above. More than a decade of hard work, more than 20 years of his grandfather's painstaking efforts, had been destroyed before he could even react. Today, it was not only the hundreds of thousands of the Zhu family's Jingguo army that were destroyed in this small valley. It was also his more than a decade of painstaking effort, more than a decade of patience and ambition. In the end, he was still too young. What Zhu Ling did not understand was that heroes were born in troubled times. However, there were only a few heroes in a chaotic world. Most of them were cannon fodders who were buried with the heroes. And in this world, there was no rule that whoever sacrificed enough would become a hero in troubled times. "Young master, leave quickly." The guard behind him pushed him, bringing him back to his senses. Only then did Zhu Ling see that the guards around him were already wounded, but they still surrounded him and bitterly held on. But the terrain was already extremely unfavorable to them, and the Mahist army's archers were not so easy to resist. At this time, they were already at the end of the road. Zhu Ling smiled bitterly. "Leave. Where can I go? Anywhere is good. Where there is life, there is hope. Young master, leave quickly." The guard hurriedly called out, and could not help but push Zhu Ling again, reminding him sternly, "Young master, don't forget that the old general is still waiting for you." Zhu Ling was startled, as if he had really come back to his senses. Looking up, the valley was a scene of devastation, and less than 20% of the soldiers could stand up. "Protect young master. Kill our way out," the person beside him roared. Soon, the loyal guards and retainers of the Zhu family all rushed over, supporting Zhu Ling as he rushed forward. They had lived in this forest for more than 20 years, and naturally understood where they had the best chance of escaping. The remaining soldiers seemed to understand that they were in a desperate situation, and they all roared as they rushed up the hills on both sides, wanting to perish together with the enemy. However, even more of them were shot down again. Occasionally, there were a few who climbed to the top, but they could not escape the sharp blades of the Mahist army that were already waiting there. The group of people protecting Zhu Ling were all experts in martial arts, but in the end, only 7 or 8 of them managed to escape the valley. Once they got out of the encirclement and entered the forest, it would be their world. No matter how strong the Mahist army was, it would be extremely difficult to find them in this kind of mountain range. But once they rushed out of the valley, the scene in front of them still shocked them. Even in the darkness of the night, they could still see the tragic scene of corpses strewn across the field through the dim moonlight, and the thick smell of blood in the air. These were the soldiers who had rushed out first. Unfortunately, they did not die in the barrage of arrows in the valley, but they were still unable to escape the enemy's ambush outside. "Young master, let's go." A guard riddled with wounds pulled Zhu Ling aside and said hoarsely. "Let's go." Zhu Ling said hoarsely. "Young Master Zhu." An elegant and graceful voice drifted through the bloody forest. Zhu Ling's heart trembled, and he raised his head to look. Not far from the mountain path, a white-clothed girl stood in the wind. Under the dim moonlight, the girl's face revealed a crystalline luster, and her graceful and elegant eyes held a faint luster. She suddenly appeared in this dark and bloody mountain battlefield, making people feel like she was a banshee of the forest. Chapter 662. Who are you? Zhu Ling's voice was dry and pale as he stared at the young girl in front of him and asked with difficulty. The white-clothed young girl smiled faintly at him and said apologetically, "I am Yi Li." Such an ordinary word, such an ordinary name. But in Zhu Ling's ears, these 2 words were like a thunderclap from the 9th heaven, deafening. A beat later, Zhu Ling slowly laughed. Yili. Yili. Appointed king's consort Yili, haha. As though he had heard something funny, Zhu Ling's laughter grew louder and louder until he couldn't breathe. You are Princess Ding. Yili nodded and said, I am Princess Ding. You lied to me. Zhu Ling gritted his teeth. Yili nodded. I lied to you. There was some regret and helplessness in her clear eyes, but there was no regret or guilt. When two armies fought, there was no good or evil, no right or wrong. There were only positions. If they had different positions, then they were enemies. Against enemies, no matter the means, this was the principle that Yili recognized in her previous life. Princess Ding. Zhu Ling murmured in a low voice. I heard that in the past, the army of Enchanting of Genom King of Gojoseon was almost completely wiped out by Princess Ding. Today, Zhu Ling lost to Princess Ding again, but it wasn't a loss. To have Wang Fei go through so much trouble, it is the fortune of 3 lifetimes. Yili said with a helpless smile, Zhu Gongxi's army of 100,000 is not a lot, but our army is lacking soldiers right now. If Gongxi suddenly appeared, it would cause a lot of trouble for the Mahist army. In desperate times, we can only use desperate measures. If I have been rude, please forgive me. You have targeted the Jingguojun from the start? Zhu Ling asked. Yili smiled faintly and did not deny it. Old General Zhu has silently hidden more than 100,000 soldiers and horses near Bian City. Presumably, he also has a lot of provisions. To tell you the truth, the first thing we are interested in is not young Master Zhu's army, but the provisions to feed them. Not far away, Feng Zhiyao strolled over in a bright red brocade robe. The long sword in his hand was still dripping with blood. Yili smiled helplessly. She looked at Feng Zhiyao and asked, Why are you here? Feng Zhiyao said with a smile, Wang Fei is personally in danger. If I don't come, how can I explain to the prince? Yili frowned and looked at Feng Zhiyao indifferently. You don't have to tell him. Feng Zhiyao raised his eyebrows. Did Wang Fei think that it was possible to hide it? Seeing the exchange of glances between the two, Zhu Ling's expression dimmed. He sighed softly and looked calmly at the young woman in white. What does Wang Fei want? Yili was silent for a moment and then said faintly, Young master, please come back with us. Zhu Ling was silent. A moment later, he raised his head and laughed. Pointing at Yili, he said loudly, I, Zhu Ling, have accomplished nothing in my life. But as a member of the Zhu family, I will not be a prisoner. I will not give you the chance to threaten my grandfather. Yili sighed regretfully and said, Then, what does young master want? Zhu Ling took the long sword of the guard next to him and pointed at the black cloud cavalry behind Feng Zhiyao. He said in a low voice, I ask for death in battle. The smile on Feng Zhiyao's face slowly faded and was replaced by a serious expression. In his view, Zhu Ling was still immature. In a few more years, his achievements would be above his own. As a general, even if the other was a defeated general, he admired and was willing to fulfill his wish. He casually cut a piece of cloth and wiped the blood off the sword. Feng Zhiyao nodded and said, Young Master Zhu, please. Wait. Yili's voice came from the side. Feng Zhiyao raised an eyebrow and put away his long sword to look at Yili. Yili raised her hand to stop Lin Han behind her. She slowly walked forward and looked at the youth whose clothes were stained with blood. She said softly and clearly, This consort is willing to fight with young master Wang Fei. Feng Zhiyao and the others were shocked and wanted to stop her. Even though Zhu Ling's army had been defeated, Zhu Ling himself was still an expert. The bloodstains on his body weren't his. In fact, Zhu Ling hadn't really done anything tonight. Yi waved her hand to stop Feng Xiao and the others from trying to persuade her. She slowly walked in front of Zhu Ling. This consort is willing to fight with young master. Is this possible? I have heard that Wang Fei is also an expert. This one is fortunate. Please. In the not-so-vast forest, corpses were strewn everywhere and blood flowed like a river. On the battlefield littered with the corpses of Xiling soldiers, a man in white and a woman in white stood facing each other calmly. If not for the corpses and blood-stained swords, this would have been a beautiful scene. Not far away, there was a crowd silently watching them. The long sword in Zhu Ling's hand trembled and drew out 2 silver sword flowers. Yi smiled faintly at him. A snow-white dagger flashed at her fingertips. It seemed to only pause for a moment. The 2 figures charged at each other at great speed. For a moment, the 2 figures intersected and then tangled together. Zhu Ling's sword was filled with sword energy. Yi dagger also flashed with a dark and cold aura. Zhu Ling quickly found that he could not gain any advantage against this woman in close combat. It even greatly restricted his swordsmanship. So he quickly pulled away from Yi. However, how could Yi give him the chance to do so? Her cold dagger was like a maggot that stuck to his bones as it brushed past his clothes again and again. The skin under his clothes was also stirred up by a layer of chill. The long sword and short dagger collided. Yi's hand holding the dagger trembled slightly. After all, it was difficult for a woman to compete against a man in strength. Frowning, the dagger moved along the blade and sliced at Zhu Ling's wrist. Zhu Ling lowered his wrist and hurriedly dodged. Princess Ding is very skilled. Young Master Zhu praises me too much. Outside the battlefield, Feng Xiao frowned as he stared at the 2 fighting. But he had to admit that Wang Fei had improved quickly in the past few years. Even against a rare expert like Zhu Ling, she was not at a disadvantage. Lin Han had come to his side at some point. He was also staring at the 2 fighting. He asked, "Young Master Feng San, why are you here?" "General Zhang." Feng Xiao said, "Qin Feng is enough there. Even if he is not enough, he can stall for time until we get back. I am worried about Wang Fei going into danger alone. But are your wounds okay?" Lin Han rubbed his back and shook his head. That wound looked fierce and dangerous, but the person who had done it had calculated and avoided a vital spot. It could only count as a flesh wound. Feng Xiao raised his eyebrows and smiled. "I think it should be fine. This young master did it personally. This young master calculated well, didn't he? Many thanks to young Master Feng San for showing mercy." Lin Han gritted his teeth. Even though he had done it willingly, no one would be in a good mood after being cut for no reason. What's more, the culprit was still there proudly taking credit for it. Lin Han deeply felt that this young Master Feng San should be taught a lesson. Chapter 663. Wang Fei, be careful. Feng Xiao, who had been laughing merrily, saw the silver light flash and hurriedly warned in a stern voice. On the other side, one of Zhu Ling's subordinates looked at Yi, who was evenly matched with Zhu Ling, and a vicious light flashed through his eyes. The moment Yi and Zhu Ling separated, a hidden weapon flashing with silver light shot out. Hearing Feng Xiao's warning, Yi also heard the sound of a hidden weapon breaking through the air behind her. Without turning her head, she swung the dagger in her hand backwards to block the hidden weapon behind her. But Zhu Ling, who was not far away, suddenly leapt at her. Yi frowned slightly. Just as she was about to send out a palm strike, she saw Zhu Ling push her aside. The hidden weapon shot into Zhu Ling's chest without any obstruction. "Young master!" The guard shouted harshly. Before they could react, the long arrows of the Mahist army had penetrated their chests. Yili steadied herself and turned to look at the person on the ground. A hint of shock flashed across her beautiful face. Feng Zhiyao saw that Wang Fei was fine and released a breath. He hurriedly led people forward to see if there was anyone alive in that group to prevent another hidden weapon like the one just now. That hidden weapon was a common willow leaf dart. The entire dart had shot into Zhu Ling's chest and only the head of the dart glowing with a blue light was exposed. Feng Zhiyao's expression changed slightly. He said, "There's poison on the dart." Lin Han looked at Zhu Ling on the ground and said faintly, "Even if he did not block it, the dart would not have hit Wang Fei." Originally, Yili's dagger could have knocked the dart away, but it had been knocked aside by Zhu Ling. Zhu Ling was lying on the ground covered in blood. His upper body was pillowed on the body of a soldier who had been dead for a long time. His eyes were dim as he looked at Yili in front of him. His lips moved but he did not say anything in the end. Yili lowered her head to look at him and said indifferently, "Why do you have to do this?" The handsome young man forced a smile on his lips and said, "I've lost. My life is actually like this," Yili said calmly. "Victory and defeat are common in war. You can only flip your cards if you're alive. If you're dead, you'll have nothing." Zhu Ling was stunned for a moment before he quickly shook his head and smiled at her. "What's the point of saying all this now? I never thought that I would be defeated like this. Just like how I never thought that you would actually be the chosen imperial concubine." Yili was silent. Zhu Ling smiled faintly and said, "You don't have to feel sorry. I'm also tired. The poison on the willow leaf dart was obviously not an ordinary poison. After a while, black blood flowed out from the corner of Zhu Ling's mouth and he slowly closed his eyes. Yili looked at the scene of corpses lying in front of her. She looked at the young man whose moon-white clothes were already stained with blood. She closed her eyes peacefully. Suddenly, she felt a bone-chilling cold and couldn't help but wrap her arms around herself. "Princess, he didn't want to live. It's not your fault," Lin Han whispered. "Even if Zhu Ling didn't block the dart, Princess would be fine." They could see it clearly from so far away, so could Zhu Ling who was next to them. From the moment he pulled out his sword and asked for the battle, he already had the will to die. Such a proud young man had tasted such a crushing defeat in the first battle of his life. He had no reason to let himself live. "I know." Yili nodded and said, "Clean up the battlefield and go back to reinforce General Zhang." "Yes, Princess," Feng Zhiyao replied. In a small town dozens of miles away, Zhu Yan, who couldn't sleep late at night, stood on the city wall and looked into the distance. Suddenly, an inexplicable tremor made him stunned. He stared blankly at the southwest direction and moved his lips. 2 lines of turbid tears slowly flowed down his wrinkled face. The West Hill defenders in the small town suddenly launched an attack in the 4th night watch period. Although the Mahist army had been vigilant, the 4th night watch period was the time when most soldiers were sleeping. The sudden attack caused the Mo family army to be in a state of chaos. But after all, the Mahist army was an elite army. Soon, they reacted and fought with Zhu Yan's Shilling army. What's going on? Why did Zhu Yan suddenly attack? Behind the army, Zhang Qilan stared at the battlefield in front of him and asked in a deep voice. He had been in the army for half of his life, so it was easy for him to see that the morale of the West Hill defenders in front of him was completely different from before. It was clear that they wanted to die together with the Mahist army. Looking up at the old figure standing on the city wall in the distance, Zhang Qilan always felt that something had happened that he didn't know. With Zhu Yan's experience and ability in war, it was absolutely impossible for him to make such a decision. On the other hand, Qin Feng, who was at the side, had a calm expression. He said indifferently, it's probably because Princess Consort and the others succeeded. But, we haven't received the news yet. How did Zhu Yan get the news? Succeeded. Zhang Qilan turned around and grabbed Qin Feng's collar and said, "You haven't told me, where did Princess go?" Qin Feng slowly slapped away the hand that was grabbing his collar and said, "Wang Fei has gone to investigate where Zhu Ling's army of 100,000 is staying. And, there should be a large number of provisions there. In this way, we don't have to worry about provisions and military supplies in a short time." What? Zhang Qilan was shocked. Princess went. Qin Feng laughed and said, "Otherwise, why do you think we are guarding this useless county these days? If they hide in the mountains and refuse to come out, even if we send in 300 or 400,000 troops, we may not be able to do anything to them. Now they come out by themselves, right? As soon as they come out, we can take the opportunity to destroy that place. The 100,000 troops that went back last night are probably gone. Otherwise, Zhu Yan wouldn't be so crazy." Zhang Qilan took a few deep breaths. He felt that he was almost scared to death by this sudden news. But, this was good news, wasn't it? Even if Zhu Yan was crazy, he was not afraid of him in this dark fight. The difference in strength between the two sides was not much. It was hard to say who would win in the end. In the chaotic battle between the two armies, the sound of horse hooves came from afar. The Mahist army soldiers who were familiar with them all showed joy. "It's the Black Cloud Cavalry. The Black Cloud Cavalry is coming." In the southwest, a black cavalry swept over like a gust of wind. They rushed into the battlefield quickly. Soon, the battle that was originally evenly matched became one-sided. Behind the black cavalry, Yi Li and Mo Xiaoyao rode horses one after the other and quickly merged into the camp of the Mahist army. Seeing Yi Li coming back from afar, Zhang Qilan quickly led people to greet her. "Princess." Yi Li glanced at the battlefield in front of her and of course saw the lonely old figure on the tower. She paused for a moment and said, "General Zhang, you don't have to be so polite. How is the battle?" Zhang Qilan smiled and said, "Princess, don't worry. With the Black Cloud Cavalry joining in, the defenders of Xiling will be wiped out before dawn." Seeing Yi Li come back with his own eyes, Zhang Qilan was completely relieved. A few days ago, the princess came with Qin Feng and others, saying that they were under the order of the prince to help him defend the city. But ever since the princess consort came, he had never seen her again. It was not until just now that he knew what the princess saw. It only scared him so much that his heart was still trembling. If something happened to the princess, how could they explain it to the prince? Chapter 664. Congratulations, Your Highness. You have wiped out hundreds of thousands of Jinghua army without any effort. Zhang Qilan smiled. Yi Li smiled faintly and shook her head. If it weren't for the general, it wouldn't be so easy. The killing continued until the sky was dark. The West Hill defenders finally could not resist and gradually retreated into the city. The city gates and walls of the small city were unable to provide any form of defense. The Mo family army and the Black Cloud Cavalry only used less than 2 hours to knock open the city gates and once again charge into the small city. In fact, there were not many West Hill defenders in the small city. Only intermittent fighting sounds came from some streets and alleys from time to time. Yi Li and the others stepped into the city. The soldiers who entered the city first came to report, "General Zhu Yan is still on the tower." Everyone looked at each other. Yi Li whispered, "Let's go and see." The others naturally had no objection. They followed Yi Li and stepped on the tower of the small city. In the corner of the tower, Zhu Yan was wearing an old battle robe. He stood with his hands behind his back and looked in the direction of Bian City in the distance. Even Yili and the others did not seem to hear it. Yili was not in a hurry. She just calmly looked at the back of the old man. After a long time, Zhu Yan slowly turned around and looked at everyone. Finally, his eyes fell on Yili, who was in white, and reached out his hand. He asked in a deep voice, "This is Miss Yang." Yili cupped her hands and said respectfully with a faint smile, "Junior Yili greets General Zhu." Zhu Yan nodded and smiled. "Is she really the princess? She is so young. She is really a young talent. The Prince Ding mansion is blessed." Yili whispered, "Senior, you flatter me." Zhu Yan looked at her with a trace of indescribable strangeness in his eyes. After hesitating for a moment, he asked, "My useless grandson, how did you deal with him?" Yili sighed slightly and whispered, "Master Zhu has died in the battle. I'm sorry for your loss." Zhu Yan's body trembled slightly. His hand holding the spear could not help but shake. In the end, he could only look up at the sky and let out a long sigh. He said, "So he died in battle. Fine. It's my fault. Originally, he could have." His only grandson had been very intelligent and talented since he was young. If it wasn't for him, he could have lived a free life with fame and fortune. Because of him, because of his wishes and ambitions, Zhu Ling had hidden himself deep in the mountains at the age of 12 or 13, refusing to see outsiders. Even if he died on the battlefield, no one would ever know his name, and he would never receive the status and glory that he deserved. Of Zhu Yan's his mansion, of sorry for of his death. Master Zhu Yan's, Zhu Yan of his. Zhu Yan shook his head and said, "Princess Ding, you don't have to persuade me. I'm almost 70 years old. I've lived long enough. Since I've lost today, I have nothing to say." Feng Zhiyao frowned slightly and said loudly, "Why do you say that, General Zhu? The Mahist army is not a ruthless person." Zhu Yan looked at Feng Zhiyao and could not help but laugh. He laughed and said, "Do you mean that the Mahist army still wants to persuade me to surrender? I'm of no use to the Mahist army. What's more, I've fought for the West Hill for half of my life. In the end, I've lost my integrity. It's ridiculous." Yili looked down and said lightly, "General, you misunderstood me. You are of noble character and unquestionable integrity. The Mahist army dare not persuade you to surrender. Now that victory and defeat have been decided between us, the old general has long since retired. Please leave now. The Prince Ding mansion will not make things difficult for you." Zhu Yan looked at Yili and asked, "Aren't you afraid that I'll come back and fight against the Mahist army after I leave?" Yili shook her head and said, "I believe in you, General." After a long silence on the gate tower, Zhu Yan finally laughed loudly and shook his head. He said, "Thank you for your kindness, Princess. It's a pity." Zhu Yan was Jingtian General of the West Hill in life and death. Today, Zhu Yan is defeated. He has no face to see the elders and the late Emperor of the West Hill. I'd rather die. Old General, Zhu Ling calmly looked at the woman in white in front of him, with a touch of regret and helplessness in his eyes. It's a pity. How could he not know that his grandson was brought up by him? When Ling He mentioned the woman named Yang Xianya to him, he knew that the woman was a little different in his eyes. Now he finally saw a woman who could make his grandson look at her differently. But it was a pity. Fate made fools of people. Old General Zhu. Under everyone's shocked gazes, the old man, who was already 70 years old, suddenly leaped up and fell off the city wall. Yili stepped forward. Her sleeves moved slightly, but she stopped in the end. The crowd went forward and stood on the gate to look down. At the gate of the city, the old man lay quietly. Blood slowly flowed out from under him, dyeing the ground under him and the white hair on his head red. Yili silently looked at the old man who had lost his life under the city wall. Her eyes were sad. "Princess?" Feng Zhiyao asked worriedly. Yili calmly turned around and said, "Restrain yourself. Give him a proper burial." "Yes." "Do you think this general is afraid of you?" "Ha! General Long, do you want to know how your General Zhu is?" Long Yang's heart was cold. He squinted and said, "What do you want to say?" Yunting laughed. "Zhu Yan is dead, and the hundreds of thousands of Jingguo army hidden in the mountains have been wiped out. Do you think that if you hide in the city every day, our prince can't do anything about it? Or do you really think that there is no one in the Mahist army? We are just here to play with you. When the prince has dealt with Zhu Yan and the Jingguo army, he will naturally come back to meet you, General Feng Tian." Zhu Yan was dead. Hearing this, not only Long Yang and Lei Tingfeng were shocked, but also the generals of the West Hill army guarding the city were shocked. Although the reputation of the three famous generals of West Hill had been suppressed by Genom of Gojoseon for more than 20 years, the generals and soldiers naturally knew about them. Bian City had been besieged for only a few days, and hundreds of thousands of Jingguo army had been wiped out. Even General Jing Tian had died in battle. How could the generals and soldiers of West Hill not be shocked? After all, Long Yang was a veteran of the battlefield. He suppressed the shock in his heart and sneered, "You're exaggerating. Come up and let me have a look." Yunting was not as angry as a few days ago when he was provoked by Long Yang. He smiled and waved the war flag in his hand. Behind the Mahist army camp, the war drums suddenly sounded, and the soldiers of the Mahist army also followed the movement of the flags and moved into battle formation. It was obvious that they were ready to attack the city. Long Yang only took a glance and understood why Lei Tingfeng said that today was different from a few days ago. Such a huge battle formation was definitely not something that these young generals in front of him could set up. This also showed that the Mahist army had no patience to confront them. At the same time, Long Yang understood that what the young general of the Mahist army said was probably not false. The hidden hundreds of thousands of elite soldiers and Zhu Yan were all gone. Sighing helplessly, Long Yang ordered his men to stay in the city. "Old General, is old General Zhu?" Lei Tingfeng asked worriedly. Long Yang said lightly, "It bodes ill rather than well." "Then we?" Lei Tingfeng asked. Long Yang looked at him and shook his head. "We can't go out of the city to fight anymore. Defend and wait for reinforcements." "Yes," Lei Tingfeng said quietly. Under the city tower, Yunting looked at the West Hill soldiers who were guarding the city gate and refused to come out to fight. He could not help but stomp his feet. Chen Yun helplessly tugged at Yunting's sleeve and said, "As your highness expected, the enemy won't come out and fight us in close quarters." Yunting angrily said, "I don't believe that he can hide in the city forever. Killing God of the Western region. He's more like a coward." Chen Yun smiled and said, "He doesn't have to hide in the city for a lifetime. As long as he can defend for a month or two, when the West Hill reinforcements arrive, we will be in trouble." Yunting said impatiently, "I don't believe that there is no way to get him out of the city. Fight for me." There was a moat in front of Bian City. The river was quite wide. If they wanted to cross the river, they would have to lower the drawbridge or find a way on their own. In the past few days, the young generals did not completely waste their time arguing with the other side. They had ordered the craftsmen in the Mahist army to build more than a dozen long ladders. Once they were placed on the surface of the river, they could cross the river by laying down wooden planks. Chen Yun looked at the soldiers in front of him braving the enemy's arrow rain to set up the bridge planks. Many of them had already died in the chaotic arrows. He could not help but grit his teeth. For a city like Bien City that was easy to defend and hard to attack, it was impossible to break through without paying a certain amount of casualties. Even if they braved the arrow rain, they still managed to set up the bridge. The archery skills of the Mahist army soldiers were not just for show. Even from the bottom to the top, many West Hill soldiers fell off the city wall. Most of the Mahist army crossed the moat. Some people climbed up the ladders to the top of the city wall. Some people shot arrows from the bottom to the top of the city wall. The water in the moat behind them gradually turned red. Behind the Mahist army, Mo Xiaoyao appeared on the battlefield with a group of people. They did not participate in the battle. Instead, they stood in the distance and watched quietly. After a long time, they heard Mo Xiaoyao laugh and say, "Yunting and the others look pretty good." They had lost more than they won, but they could still hold on. They could even raise the morale of the Mahist army. For these young generals who had not really been on the battlefield, it was already pretty good. Chapter 666. Beside him, Zhuajing smiled and said, "Don't the prince and consort trust them?" Mo Xiaoyao nodded and looked up at the city wall in the distance. He said in a low voice, "Get ready to attack." Yes. Dark clouds covered thousands of miles in the clear sky. A low and hoarse voice sounded in the air, and soon, beautiful fireworks bloomed in the air. Some of the West Hill soldiers guarding the city were shocked to find that there were ropes hanging in the air in several directions outside the city. Then, black figures moved along the ropes and quickly moved towards the city. Long Yang could naturally see this situation. His eyes narrowed and he said sternly, "Shoot." Countless arrows flew towards the people sliding on the ropes. But even faster, a group of men in black appeared in the city and mercilessly shot their bows at the soldiers guarding the city. What's going on? How did these people appear? Black figures wearing Mahist army uniforms kept appearing in the city. These people were different from the usual Mahist army. They were obviously stronger than the Mahist army soldiers. They were a group of a few dozen people, and everywhere they went, the West Hill defenders suffered heavy losses. At the same time, they had to take care of the Mahist army outside the city, which was attacking with all their might. For a moment, the West Hill defenders were in a mess. On the city wall, Long Yang and Lei Tingfeng's faces were ashen. "Old General," Long Yang gritted his teeth and said, "Capture everyone in the city from the Chu state and the northwest and bring them up to the city tower." "Old General." Lei Tingfeng's face changed when he heard this. Of course, he knew what Long Yang wanted to do. In fact, there were many who did this when two countries were at war. However, Lei Tingfeng was doubtful about how effective this would be. Gritting his teeth, Lei Tingfeng turned and left. Although there were many Mahist army in the city, there were still hundreds of thousands of West Hill defenders in Bien City. It was difficult for the small Mahist army to affect the overall situation. In less than an hour, the West Hill soldiers had captured the people of Dechu State in Bien City and brought them to the top of the city wall. Bien City was the second largest city in West Hill, and its prosperity was no less than that of the Emperor of Xiling. There were many people from different countries living here. Most of them were citizens of Dechu State, and a large portion of them were citizens of the Northwest Mahist Army. These people were taken to the top of the city wall and placed on top of the battlements of Bien City. If the Mahist army below wanted to come up, they would have to get past them first. If they wanted to shoot, they would have to kill them first. Most of these people were ordinary people, and the sudden experience of war was enough to make them tremble with fear. Now, they were even brought to the top of the city wall to block the Mahist army's arrows. Many of them were so scared that they started to cry. "Long Yang! You shameless old man!" Seeing this, Yunting finally couldn't help but curse again. Beside him, Chen Yun and the others also had ugly expressions. Not to mention that these people were citizens of Dechu State and the Northwest. Even if they were citizens of West Hill, using ordinary people to block arrows was a shameful thing for a general. What do we do now? How would I know? Go and report to the prince. Chen Yun said. After all, they weren't cold-hearted. On the battlefield, it was their duty to fight to the death between two armies. But it was difficult for them to make the decision to shoot these ordinary people who had no power to resist. In fact, there was no need for them to report. Mo Xiuyao, who had been behind the Maoist army all this time, naturally saw the situation. Standing beside him, Zhuo Jing frowned and said, "Prince, what should we do?" They really hadn't expected Long Yang to do this. But when Long Yang was young, he had been called the killing god of the western region. In the past, he had killed many ordinary people in the western region. His actions were unexpected but also reasonable. Mo Xiuyao stood up and stared calmly at the top of the city wall in the distance. He wants to delay us first and clear out the Qi Lin in the city. Bian City's defenses were very good. They had spent so many days, but the Maoist army that could enter Bian City was less than 1,000 people. If they were faced with hundreds of thousands of West Hill defenders, they had no chance of winning. Long Yang didn't want to be attacked from the front and the back. He had to clear out the enemy who had entered the city and figure out how they had entered. And all of this needed time. Let's go and take a look. Because of the people on the city wall, the Maoist army's attack on the city temporarily stopped. But the soldiers on both sides didn't let down their guard. The Maoist army's black camp suddenly parted to form a path. A white-haired man in white walked out of the army, followed by a few guards and generals. Mo Xiuyao raised his hand and glanced at the people on the city wall who had been pushed out. He said in a low voice, "West Hill General Feng Tian, I've heard a lot about you." Long Yang appeared on the city wall and looked at the white-haired man in the distance. He nodded and said, "Prince Ding, Mo Xiuyao. Nice to meet you." When these words were said, the people on the city wall who were sobbing and crying were all stunned. They looked at the white-haired man below the city wall. Some people even became excited and shouted for help. "Prince Ding is here. Prince Ding is here. Your Highness, please save us." Someone shouted, and very quickly, more people started crying and shouting. Suddenly, there was a wave of crying on the city wall. "What do you want, General Feng Tian?" Mo Xiuyao asked calmly. His voice wasn't loud and didn't even have the slightest hint of anger. But strangely, it spread throughout the entire battlefield amidst the crying. Long Yang looked at him deeply and said, "As a general, I am deeply ashamed to use such a method. But, Prince, please give the order to retreat for 30 li." Mo Xiuyao asked, "What if I don't agree?" Long Yang smiled calmly. He raised his hand and the head of the man closest to him was chopped off on the spot, falling down the city wall. Blood immediately gushed out, startling the people on the side and causing them to scream again. Mo Xiuyao was silent for a moment. Finally, he raised his head and said calmly, "Once Bian City is broken, I will kill you. This king wants to tear you to shreds." Long Yang didn't seem to care. If Bian City falls, then this old man's life will come to an end. "Since I will die anyway, what difference does it make? What is Prince's answer?" Mo Xiuyao raised his eyebrows and smiled. He said in a low voice, "I's answer is..." Whoosh! Mo Xiuyao turned around and took a bow and arrow from the hands of a soldier next to him. Drawing the bow and releasing the arrow, he completed the entire set of actions in an instant. Everyone watched in a daze as the arrow with a silver light streaked across the sky and sank into the chest of a young man on the city wall. Mo Xiuyao threw the bow and arrow back and said in a low voice, "Attack the city." Once the order was given, the sounds of killing rose again. The first to be affected were the innocent people on the city wall. Amidst the sounds of killing and crying, Mo Xiaoyao turned around and left indifferently, leaving behind a cold figure and a low and gloomy voice. Long Yang, I want all the people in your city to be buried with you. The fierce siege continued without rest. This time, both sides understood that it was no longer a small fight like a few days ago. Unless one side was defeated and the other side was victorious, there would be no rest. Perhaps because of the hundreds of innocent Chu state people on the city wall, the Mahist army's attack became even more dauntless. After a few hours, Bian City's defense finally showed signs of decline. Chapter 667. In the city, Long Yang was sitting in an empty room with a gloomy look. He knew that Zhu Yan was dead. It wouldn't be long before Bian City was broken. Perhaps it was his fortune to be able to fight on the battlefield in his old age. However, such an inexplicable fiasco made it difficult for him to face it. One of his biggest mistakes was that he heard Mo Xiaoyao's words clearly when he left. The whole city was buried with him. Mo Xiaoyao wanted to massacre the city. Long Yang didn't doubt Mo Xiaoyao's words. When he was young, he had massacred a city before. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been called the god of killing in the western region. In fact, if he was young, he might not think that it was a big deal for Mo Xiaoyao to want to massacre a city. But now, he was old after all. There were hundreds of thousands of people in Bian City. If Mo Xiaoyao really massacred the whole city, General. The soldier outside the door came in a hurry to report. Long Yang opened his eyes and said indifferently, "What's the matter?" The soldier said, "The East City can't be defended. General, please retreat as soon as possible." Retreat? Long Yang frowned and asked, "Who said to retreat?" Perhaps Long Yang's tone was too harsh. The soldier reported carefully, "It's Prince Genom of Gojoseon. Genom of Gojoseon said that Bian City can't be defended. He wants to retreat to Rongqing behind to stop the Mahist army." Long Yang shook his head and smiled bitterly. Even Bian City can't stop the Mahist army. How can Rongqing, that fragile city wall, stop the Mahist army? Stupid. The whole army stays and fights with the Mahist army in the city. Maybe we can take down half of the Mahist army. Many times, fighting in the city was filled with people's lives. It had little to do with tactics. Moreover, they could take the initiative in the city. The Mahist army and the Shilling army were not too different in ability. At least Long Yang was confident that 2 Shilling soldiers could definitely deal with 1 Mahist army. In this way, they could at least wipe out half of the Mahist army in Bian City. Only then would the defending army behind be able to hold back the Mahist army. The soldier looked at Long Yang hesitantly and said, "But Crown Prince Genom of Gojoseon has already retreated with his troops." What? Long Yang suddenly stood up, and the soldier quickly said, "Prince Genom of Gojoseon said that if we let the Mahist army enter the city, it will be too late. He has already led the remaining 100,000 soldiers and is preparing to withdraw from the West Gate." Long Yang quickly walked out the door and said, "Idiot. There are still tens of thousands of Mahist army soldiers guarding the small town ahead. Where does he think he can retreat to?" But when Long Yang arrived at the West City, he could only see the Shilling army's horse hooves and smoke in the distance. Lei Dingfeng had brought along the Shilling army's most elite and most complete army of more than 100,000. The moment these men and horses withdrew, the originally sturdy defense instantly opened up a few large holes, and the Mo family army surged into the city like a tide. Under the West Gate, Long Yang tiredly closed his eyes and sighed in a low voice, "Zhu Yan, we are all finished." Although Lei Dingfeng took most of the people away, the Shilling soldiers were not just for show. It was already noon the next day when the Mahist army completely took over the entire Bian City. After a day and night of continuous fighting, even the Mo family army soldiers who were known for their bravery and fighting prowess were exhausted. Their eyes were bloodshot and their bodies were exhausted. When the shielding defenders in the city were finally eliminated, the soldiers burst into cheers. Many people directly sat down on the street and fell asleep under the eaves. At noon, the sun was shining brightly. Mo Xiuyao and his people just stepped into Bian City. Looking at the corpses of the two armies lying on the street, many soldiers on both sides of the street directly sat down and fell asleep. Mo Xiuyao waved his hand to stop the people around him who wanted to report loudly. As he walked past the corpses, he asked in a low voice, "Where is Long Yang?" Shuo Jing whispered, "Long Yang is in an empty house in the west of the city. There are already people guarding there. In addition, Long Yang has released many people in the city." Maybe it was because Mo Xiuyao said that he would bury all the people in the city with him. Yesterday night, Long Yang opened the gate of the West City and let many people out of the city. The Maoist army had strict military discipline. Although Mo Xiuyao said that, he did not officially order a massacre in the city. So as long as the soldiers in the battle were not obstructed by ordinary people, they would not attack ordinary people. Last night, about half of the people had escaped. Mo Xiuyao shook his head carelessly. "Let's go see Long Yang." "How is the consort?" Shuo Jing said. "Last night, Lei Tingfeng retreated with his people and fought with General Zhang in the west. He took about 20 to 30,000 people and rushed over. The consort ordered a pause in the pursuit. The army will reorganize in Bian City for 2 days. The consort should be back in a while." Hearing this, Mo Xiuyao's gloomy eyes flashed with a trace of warmth. He said lightly, "Order people to clean up the battlefield and let the soldiers rest. Go and bring Long Yang here." "Yes, Prince." Shuo Jing received the order and left. Mo Xiuyao turned and went to the governor's mansion in Bian City. The governor's mansion had already been taken care of. Originally, the battle in the city did not affect the mansion too much. The civil officials in Bian City who had not yet escaped had been locked up here by the Maoist army. Seeing Mo Xiuyao come in, the West Hill officials all had different expressions. Some were begging, some were unyielding, some were fearful, and some were hostile. Mo Xiuyao did not have the heart to pay attention to them. He waved his hand and ordered people to take them away. Not long after he sat down to rest, the guard outside came in to report, "Prince, Long Yang is here." Mo Xiuyao opened his eyes. They were filled with coldness. "Let him in." Not long after, Long Yang strolled in. Shuo Jing followed behind him, but did not order people to hold him. Long Yang was still dressed in white coarse clothes. He looked much older and more tired than he had a few days ago. At first glance, he looked like an ordinary old man from the mountains. There was no trace of the ruthless look on his face when he used innocent people as meat shields on the city gate tower. Mo Xiuyao looked at him calmly and said lightly, "General Feng Tian, nice to meet you." Chapter 668. Prince Ding, nice to meet you. Long Yang hit the man in front of him for a long time before he finally spat out a few words. This was the first time Long Yang had seen the world-famous Prince Ding. From a certain point of view, Mo Xiuyao's fame was even greater than that of his father, Mo Lufang, who had made outstanding contributions to the Dechu state. Because he had done something that Prince Ding had never done in the past few generations of Prince Ding. That was to sever all ties with the Dechu state. From then on, the Maoist army and Prince Ding had truly become a power that contended for hegemony in this world. From then on, they had truly broken free from the shackles of the Dechu state. In the future, the success or failure of the Maoist army and the Dechu state would no longer have any relation. The man in front of him was dressed in snow-white clothes. His long white hair was casually draped over his shoulders. It was completely different from this bloody battlefield, but it made Long Yang feel a trace of danger. Long Yang believed in his intuition, even if he had not been on the battlefield for more than 20 years. The man in front of her was far from being as gentle as he appeared to be. Under the pure white snow of the sky and the white snow of the mountains, there was clearly a frightening stench of blood that surged. Mo Xiaoyao calmly looked at Long Yang. He casually played with the blue and white porcelain cup in his hand as he lightly said, "Originally, I wanted to have a good chat with General Long and General Zhu. But General Long, I have to say, I's mood right now is very bad. General Long, do you know what I hate the most in my life?" Long Yang looked at Mo Xiaoyao and said in a deep voice, "Prince Ding, please enlighten me." Mo Xiaoyao slowly put down the teacup. The sound of the teacup hitting the table echoed in the quiet room. "It's being threatened. What I hate the most in my life is being threatened by others. In addition, I am more curious as to why General I would give up on attacking the city for the sake of those people from the Chu state." Mo Xiaoyao slowly laughed as if he had said something funny. Long Yang was silent for a moment before he said, "I was wrong. It was probably because, when one got old, one's heart would soften. If this old man was young, I would have made the same decision as Prince Ding." Mo Xiaoyao nodded and smiled. As expected, General Long is the one who understands I the best. If that's the case, is General Long prepared to accept the consequences of your decision? Hearing this, Long Yang's expression changed, and he said in a low voice, "Prince Ding, you've already taken down Bian City. Why do you still need to kill? This matter was done by this old man alone. If Prince Ding is angry, you might as well take this old man's life." Mo Xiaoyao smiled faintly and declined to comment. "I forgot to tell General Long that although General Long released most of the people in the city last night, but the Mahist army also captured many of the West Hills soldiers. Barely, it should be enough to make up for the number of people who escaped, right? Prince Ding." Long Yang painfully closed his eyes. This old man will take responsibility for his own actions. Even if Prince Ding cuts this old man to pieces, this old man will not say a word. Please, let the innocent people and soldiers go. Mo Xiaoyao acted as if he didn't hear him. He waved to the people at the door and smiled, "Take General Long Yang to see." Outside the door, Zhuo Jing waved his hand and 2 guards came in to take Long Yang out. In the room, Mo Xiaoyao slowly closed his eyes. After a long time, a low voice slowly came out from under his long white hair. "These people are really annoying. Father, big brother, wait until I kill them all, then you can rest in peace, then no one will be able to hurt Li anymore." After Yili finished dealing with the matters on the battlefield, she brought Feng Zhiyao and the others back to Bian City. The Mahist army soldiers outside the city were sweeping the battlefield. There was a thick smell of blood in the air. A group of people walked on the streets of the city. From time to time, the soldiers who were cleaning the streets would come forward to salute them. Feng Zhiyao frowned and said with some confusion, "What is going on? Why is there not a single person in the city? Even if the battle had just ended and the people were afraid to go out, it shouldn't be to the point where there was not a single person. Even the windows on the 2 sides of the street didn't have anyone peeking out. The entire city was quiet. Other than the soldiers who were cleaning the streets, it was like a dead city." The soldier in front hesitated and looked at Yi Li and the others before reporting to Wang Fei, "General Feng, Prince just ordered all the people and prisoners to be taken to the west side of the city." Yi Li frowned and asked, "Taken to the west side of the city? What for?" "Outside the west side of the city is the execution ground of Bian City." "Execution ground?" Feng Zhiyao thought for a while and said, "Which important general of West Hill has been captured? Long Yang or Ladingfeng?" "That's not right. Even if they were captured, there is no need to rush to execute them now, right? Killing Long Yang was not a big deal. It would be a blow to West Hill's morale. But Lei Tingfeng's identity was more valuable alive than dead. Young Master Feng felt dizzy and forgot that Lei Tingfeng had just slipped away from his hands last night. The soldier looked at Yi Li and didn't say anything. Yi Li frowned and said, "Tell me the truth." The soldier said in a low voice, "Prince ordered all the prisoners and people of Bian City to be killed." What? Yi Li and Feng Zhiyao were both shocked. They looked at each other. Feng Zhiyao steadied his mind and asked, "What is going on?" The soldier quickly explained the situation of the battle. Of course, it also included how Long Yang threatened them with the people of Dechu State in Bian City to withdraw their troops. They didn't have time to finish listening. The group hurried to the execution ground outside the west side of the city. There was a large open area outside the west side of the city. It had been the execution ground since Bian City was built. But there was no doubt that the number of people who would be beheaded here today would be more than the total number of people in Bian City in the past few hundred years. Long Yang was held down by two Qilin soldiers. He faced the execution ground and looked helplessly at the prisoners who were forced to kneel on the ground. Many of these people were still injured. But at this time, they were forced to kneel on the ground and stick out their necks. The flat and cold bluestone ground was already stained with dark red blood. Obviously, the people kneeling now were not the first batch. Long Yang was held down by the people behind him and couldn't move. His eyes were about to pop out. Enough. Prince Ding. Enough. It's all this old man's fault. Kill me now. Long Yang's eyes were red and the veins on his forehead popped out. He was really wrong. In order to protect Bian City, he had unintentionally angered a bloodthirsty lion that had been dormant for many years. Perhaps it was because he had killed too many people when he was young that he decided to take revenge on these innocent soldiers and people in his old age. Prince Ding. Kill this old man. Long Yang roared. Mo Xiaoyao's lips curled into a smile. He raised his hand and pointed at the people in the pool of blood. I won't kill you. General Long Yang, just watch. Look at these soldiers and how these people died. It was you who caused their deaths. When two armies fight, I never bring harm to the people. This time, you forced I. After this, I believe that yesterday's situation will never happen again on the battlefield. Don't you think so? Killing innocent people like this, aren't you afraid of retribution? Long Yang said in pain. If it was in the past, Long Yang didn't believe in retribution. He only believed that man could conquer nature. But now, he had to admit that there was retribution in this world. Chapter 669. Mo Xiaoyao raised an eyebrow and laughed lightly. What retribution is I afraid of? The Prince Ding mansion has served the country loyally for generations. What good retribution have they received? Are Wang Fei and Shi Ziyi not afraid? Long Yang said. When these words were said, Mo Xiaoyao's frown instantly froze. Mo Xiaoyao suddenly looked at Long Yang. That blood-filled gaze caused Long Yang's heart to tremble. He heard Mo Xiaoyao say harshly, "Kill them." Turning back to look at Long Yang, Mo Xiaoyao said coldly, "You better pray that Li Li will be safe for the rest of her life, otherwise I will bury all the people in this world with her." Hearing Mo Xiaoyao's order, the executioners on the execution ground once again raised the knives in their hands. Stop. A clear female voice came from behind. Everyone's hands paused. They saw a white-robed figure land in the middle of the execution ground like a white cloud. Yi Li turned to look at the dark red blood at her feet and frowned. Then she looked at the sobbing commoners who had been brought to the execution ground and sighed in relief. There was still time. Lily, why have you come? Mo Xiaoyao stilled and his cold face warmed. He stood up and asked gently as he looked at the white-robed figure on the execution ground. Yili raised her eyes and looked at the man with snow-white robes and snow-white hair on the high platform. Her handsome face had a faint warmth and gentleness. It was completely different from the cold and emotionless voice that sounded like an Azura. She led Feng Zhiyao onto the high platform. Feng Zhiyao was the first to experience his prince's knife-like gaze. He helplessly rubbed his nose and stood to the side. Wang Fei had come back at this time. It had nothing to do with him. Lily, why have you come? Why don't you go back and rest after working so hard for so many days? Mo Xiaoyao asked unhappily when he saw the tiredness on Yili's face. Yili helplessly rolled her eyes at him. Who was the one who caused her to not be able to go back to rest? What's going on? Why did you suddenly? Yili asked in a low voice. If possible, she didn't want to ask Mo Xiaoyao about it in this place. But now was not the time to choose a place for her. If he hesitated, the heads of nearly 100,000 people would roll. In both her past and present life, Yili was still a soldier. She was not afraid of war, nor was she afraid of death. However, killing prisoners and innocent civilians was clearly not within her moral bottom line. Moreover, this would damage the reputation of Mo Xiaoyao and the Maoist army. A few years ago, Mo Xiaoyao had killed thousands of Dechu state soldiers in the northwest. This had already caused many scholars to criticize him. If the citizens of the city were added, then it really wasn't a good thing for Mo Xiaoyao. Mo Xiaoyao slightly knit his brows and said in a low voice, Lily, you don't need to care about these things. Go back and rest first, okay? When I finish dealing with these things, I will go back to accompany you. We can rest in Bian City for 2 days. Xiaoyao. Facing Mo Xiaoyao's obvious desire to change the topic, Yili quietly looked at him with a trace of worry in her eyes. Xiaoyao, I'm a bit tired. Can you accompany me back to rest first? We can talk about these things another day. Yili said softly. Her voice was weak and tired. Mo Xiaoyao's heart softened. He lowered his head and looked at Yili's dark eyes. Finally, he bent down and picked up Yili and walked out. Yili leaned into Mo Xiaoyao's arms and raised her head to give Feng Zhiyao a meaningful look. Feng Zhiyao nodded slightly, indicating that she would leave it to him. Only then did he rest assured and close his eyes against Mo Xiaoyao. She really was a bit tired after these few days. Mo Xiaoyao carried Yili past the execution ground. His gaze lightly swept over the kneeling West Hill soldiers. A trace of disdain and ridicule flashed through his cold eyes. Among these West Hill soldiers, there was no lack of staunch and unyielding people. After being defeated and captured, they were already prepared to die. Now that they saw Mo Xiaoyao's mocking gaze, how could they endure it? One of them fiercely spat and sneered, surnamed Mo, if you want to kill me, then kill me. 20 years later, I will be a good man again. I will definitely slaughter everyone in your Prince Ding mansion. Mo Xiaoyao's eyes were cold. He said lightly, since that is the case, I will fulfill your wish. Kill them all. After that, he no longer paid attention to the people in front of him. Carrying Yili, he strolled out of the execution ground. The people who stayed behind looked at each other. The Wang Fei clearly meant that they were not allowed to kill, but the prince wanted them all to be killed. To kill or not to kill became a problem. Logically speaking, they should naturally listen to the prince's orders. But in these years, the prince had never gone against the Wang Fei's wishes. Furthermore, the soldiers of the Mo family army were the most elite soldiers, and every one of them had the pride of a soldier. Killing people on the battlefield was one thing. They really could not bear to slaughter ordinary people who had no power to resist. General Feng, what should we do? The general supervising the execution came forward and asked. Feng Zhiyao touched his chin and pondered for a moment. He used his chin to point at the group of people who were still kneeling on the execution ground and said, "Kill them all. Leave the rest for now." The prince said to kill them all. Those who insulted and cursed Prince Ding deserved to die. But the 100 people who were with him were pitiful. They could only think of it as their bad luck. Those kneeling on the execution ground were all killed. As for the rest, of course, they would have to wait for the Princess Wang Fei's orders. Feng Zhiyao thought silently. The general supervising the execution satisfied and went to carry out the order. Feng Zhiyao looked at the ashen-faced Long Yang and secretly shook his head. Long Yang had also violated Mo Xiuyao's taboo. He had used the people of Dechu State as meat shields. If Mo Xiuyao retreated once, the West Hill generals behind him would follow suit. More importantly, there were nearly 1,000 Qilin who had entered the city first. If Mo Xiuyao really gave the order to retreat, Long Yang would free up his hands and the nearly 1,000 Qilin who had entered the city first would suffer. But, wasn't His Highness a little too angry? Yili woke up from a deep sleep. It was already dark outside. She sat up and rubbed her eyebrows. Something was wrong. Although she was very tired, it was not to the extent that she would fall asleep right after being held in Mo Xiuyao's arms. She suddenly remembered what had happened at the execution ground. Yili looked up and saw Mo Xiuyao sitting under the lamp outside the gauze screen, writing. As if he had heard Yili's figure, Mo Xiuyao put down his pen and walked into the room. He smiled and said, "You're awake." Yili nodded and looked at Mo Xiuyao carefully. Under the light of the night pearl, his handsome face had a faint smile, gentle and comfortable. Yili leaned into his arms and looked up at his tired face. She said softly, "Why don't you rest for a while? Aren't we going to stay in Bian City for 2 days? If there's anything, we can deal with it tomorrow." Mo Xiuyao rested his chin on her head. He stroked her soft hair and smiled faintly. "I can't sleep. I'll deal with everything I need to deal with so that I can accompany you tomorrow. Li, you've worked hard these days." For some reason, Yili suddenly remembered Zhu Ling's expression before he died. His white clothes were stained with blood, lying on the ground stained with blood. His eyes were dim. The smile on her face gradually faded. Yili closed her eyes with a headache. "What's wrong, Li?" Mo Xiuyao asked softly. Chapter 670. It's nothing. Yili said in a low voice, "I'm just a little tired." Mo Xiuyao's eyes moved slightly. He gently patted her delicate back and said in a gentle voice, "Since you're tired, then sleep a little longer. Let's talk about it tomorrow, okay?" Yili nodded. Leaning against Mo Xiuyao's chest really did make her feel a little drowsy. Forcing herself to stay awake, Yili said in a low voice, "Xiuyao, the war has nothing to do with the people. Don't kill the innocent, the people's hearts." Mo Xiuyao lowered his head and looked at the beautiful face that was gradually falling into a deep sleep. He lowered his head and gently kissed her. "Li's heart is too soft. This is not good. It will be very easy for others to hurt you." Innocent. Who in this world is innocent? In the temporary study of the governor's office, Mo Xiuyao sat in a chair. His expression was indifferent as he looked at Feng Zhiyao and Qin Feng in front of him. Feng Zhiyao felt extremely helpless in his heart. However, he did not dare to provoke Mo Xiuyao when his mood was obviously very bad. The originally lazy and leisurely smile on his face gradually became a stiff fake smile. In the end, he could not maintain it any longer. Looking at Qin Feng, who clearly had no intention of speaking, Feng Zhiyao coughed lightly and said, "Prince." Mo Xiaoyao raised his eyes and looked at him indifferently. He asked, "Have you finished dealing with the people on the execution ground?" "It's done." Feng Zhiyao quickly replied. "Finished." Mo Xiaoyao raised his eyebrows and laughed coldly. "Then, what are the people in the captive camp outside the city?" Feng Zhiyao smiled apologetically and said, "The person who insulted Prince and the person who was kneeling on the execution ground were all killed. Prince is very clear. As for the rest, didn't Prince not give any orders?" "Oh." Mo Xiaoyao tilted his head and looked at him with a half-smile. He asked, "Then I will give the order now. Go and kill them all." "Prince." Feng Zhiyao's face was bitter as he whispered, "Prince, please reconsider." Mo Xiaoyao looked at him coldly. Feng Zhiyao continued, "Prince, our Mahist army has strict military discipline. We never kill innocent people. If the prince killed these people in a fit of anger, the reputation of the Mahist army and the Prince Ding mansion would be ruined. Moreover, the people of West Hill were brave. If they knew that the Mahist army had massacred the city, they would definitely help the defenders of West Hill to defend the city. It will also be very disadvantageous for our future battles." Looking at Mo Xiaoyao's unmoved appearance, Feng Zhiyao sighed in his heart. He could only continue, "Moreover, the consort is kind and will not agree with the prince's actions. Why would the prince make the consort unhappy for irrelevant people?" At this point, Feng Zhiyao raised his eyes and stole a glance at Mo Xiaoyao. Seeing that he was frowning and thinking, Feng Zhiyao was slightly relieved. If the prince did not care and insisted on killing those people, then no one would be able to persuade him. After a long while, Mo Xiaoyao said coldly, "Kill all the captives and drive all the ordinary people out of the city. Feng San, if you do not do it well, then do as you see fit." Feng Zhiyao sighed in relief. In this era, there was no such thing as not killing captives. Captives captured on the battlefield could only be exchanged or used as slaves. Otherwise, they were usually killed. Although Feng Zhiyao did not care to kill the defenseless West Hill soldiers, he knew that these people could not be released. It would be troublesome to keep them alive. If Mo Xiaoyao insisted on killing them, then he did not care. "Yes, sir," Feng Zhiyao said respectfully. Looking at Mo Xiaoyao, he asked, "Prince Longyang, how should we deal with him?" Mo Xiaoyao's face darkened at the mention of Longyang. With a gloomy expression, he said, "Take Longyang to the execution ground. Let him see how those West Hill soldiers die." Feng Zhiyao finally understood why Longyang had appeared at the execution platform during the day. He shook his head in his heart. Longyang had offended the prince too much. No one could persuade him. "Yes, sir. Go and do it now. Don't let the consort know." Mo Xiaoyao added slowly. Feng Zhiyao and Qin Feng looked at each other. This kind of thing, could they hide it? "Yes. Yes, sir." After finishing, Mo Xiaoyao had no intention of letting them leave. For a moment, the two were confused. Mo Xiaoyao stared at the two for a long time before asking, "What happened to Mo Xiaoyao?" The two were stunned and did not understand what Mo Xiaoyao meant. Mo Xiaoyao frowned and said irritably, "Li has been in a bad mood." "What happened this time?" The consort was in a bad mood. The two lowered their brows and thought for a moment. They could not think of anything that made the consort in a bad mood. The war had always been going smoothly. Although the Mo family army had suffered some losses, those were all unavoidable losses that were expected. Other than that, there wasn't much else. Seeing Mo Xiaoyao's face getting worse and worse, Qin Feng said, "Zhu Ling, the grandson of General Zhu Yan, blocked a hidden weapon for the consort and died." General Zhu Yan jumped down from the tower in front of the consort and committed suicide. Qin Feng thought for a long time. Only these two things could be called special. Zhu Ling. Who is that? Mo Xiaoyao asked. Qin Feng told the story from beginning to end. Originally, Yili and Qin Feng only went to help Zhang Qilan deal with Zhu Yan, who might come out, and the Jingguo Jun, who was hiding in an unknown place. After that, the matter of Yili, Lin Han, and Lin Han sneaking into the Jingguo army's base alone was suddenly decided by Yili. She didn't tell Mo Xiaoyao, so he naturally didn't know. The more he listened, the more gloomy Mo Xiaoyao's face became. Feng Zhiyao, who was standing next to him, could not help but take 2 steps back. When Qin Feng finished, the study was silent. Feng Zhiyao bitterly waited for Mo Xiaoyao's predictable anger to hit. After waiting for a long time, he heard Mo Xiaoyao's calm voice. I know. You can go out. Ah. Feng Zhiyao was stunned. Qin Feng glanced at him coldly and turned to go out. Feng Zhiyao trembled and hurriedly rushed out as well. In the study, only Mo Xiaoyao was left alone, facing the lonely lamp on the table. Zhu Ling, a dead person, still makes Li upset. He died too easily. Chapter 671. Early in the morning, Bian City had already returned to its usual peaceful and leisurely state, but it was no longer as bustling and noisy as before. Other than the patrolling Mahist army soldiers, the streets were empty. There were no noisy people or vendors, no open shops or restaurants on both sides of the street. The huge Bian City seemed incomparably quiet and empty. Mo Xiaoyao had been invited to the study by Zhang Qilan and the others early in the morning. Yili took advantage of the free time to take Zhu Jing, Lin Han, and Qin Feng to walk around the city. Looking at the empty streets, she was silent for a moment before asking, yesterday, those people on the execution ground. Qin Feng and the others looked at each other. Qin Feng said, reporting to Wang Fei, Prince has ordered all the citizens to be expelled from Bian City. Hearing this, Yili let out a sigh of relief. No matter what, it was good that the city wasn't massacred. Expelled from Bian City. Where did those people go? Yili asked after thinking about it. Qin Feng said, they managed to keep their lives, so it's good to go anywhere. But Lei Dingfeng's army has been defeated and only 20 to 30,000 people are retreating to the west. Those citizens are also going in that direction. I'm afraid that many of them will be incorporated into Lei Dingfeng's army. When the time comes, when they go to the battlefield. Yili said lightly, when they go to the battlefield, they are the enemy. Spread the news that Long Yang used to choose state citizens as meat shields at the top of Bian City. It doesn't matter if the news is exaggerated. The 3 looked at Yili in confusion. Yili said, the matter of the prisoners and the prince wanting to kill the citizens cannot be hidden. With this reason, it will be better for the prince and the Mahist army's reputation. Once the news of Long Yang using to choose state citizens as meat shield spread, Mo Xiaoyao's actions would be easier to understand. Whether it was revenge or a moment of anger, it was fine. It was easy for people to overlook Mo Xiaoyao's actions. Besides, Prince Ding didn't massacre the entire city in the end. Zhu Jing answered and went to handle the matter. Yili continued to walk forward with Qin Feng and Lin Han. Where is Long Yang? Qin Feng hesitated for a moment, then said, it's in the prison on the west side of the city. Prince ordered a large number of soldiers to guard it. Let's go take a look, Yili said softly. Mo Xiaoyao really hated Long Yang. The place where Long Yang was locked up was not a sturdy prison. Instead, it was a small building facing the execution ground in the western part of the city. From the window of the small building, one could see the execution ground outside the city. No one knew how many people had been killed in the execution ground outside the city last night. But Long Yang definitely knew, because he was forced to watch the captives die one by one from the beginning to the end. Even after the execution, Mo Xiuyao found him a prison cell that didn't face the execution ground. The smell of blood from the execution ground could probably be smelled all night. The soldiers guarding the building didn't stop Yili. Yili waved her hand to stop the others from following. Only Qin Feng and Lin Han stepped into the small building. They hadn't seen each other for one night, but Long Yang was completely different from yesterday. Long Yang, who was already 70 years old, finally bent his back, which was still healthy and strong, down. The frown on his face had deepened overnight. At a glance, it was as if he had aged more than 10 years. His sparse white hair was scattered messily on his head. His old, turbid eyes were dim and lifeless. Anyone could see that Long Yang was in great pain. His pain had nothing to do with his body. It was his heart that was tormented by guilt and regret. He was already an old man in his 70s. He was no longer as cold-hearted and murderous as he was when he was young. Seeing the soldiers of Xiling die one by one because of his mistakes, he hated that he couldn't take their place. Cough cough. Princess Ding. Hearing the sound of footsteps coming up the stairs, Long Yang turned around with some difficulty. He saw a young woman standing at the top of the stairs. A beautiful woman in a green dress. She didn't have the aura of pearls and jade, nor did she have the grace and nobility of brocade. Her beautiful face was calm, but there was a kind of majesty that ordinary ladies and noblewomen couldn't compare to. Long Yang didn't expect that the world-famous Princess Ding would be a young woman who wasn't even 20 years old. But in a place like Bian City, a woman who could come and go freely and with such an aura could only be the king's consort. Yili nodded and said softly, "General Long Yang, nice to meet you." Long Yang smiled bitterly. How can it be nice to meet a defeated general? Yesterday, thank you for saving the lives of the people of Bian City. I didn't do it for the people of Bian City. Yili walked to a chair not far from Long Yang and sat down. Long Yang shook his head and said, "No matter what, it's a fact that consort saved them. This old man. Old madam is muddle-headed and almost killed these innocent people. This old man naturally has to thank consort." Saying this, Long Yang stood up and bowed to Yili. He was already a person who was about to die, so he didn't care much about fame and fortune. He didn't feel that it was shameful to bow to a young woman in her early 20s. Yili was startled. She glanced at Qin Feng and Zhuo Jing who were standing to the side. The two of them hurriedly came forward and helped Long Yang to his left and right, sending him back to the chair he had been sitting in. Long Yang sat down to catch his breath. Then he looked at Yili and said, "For consort to come at this time, is there something you want to say to this old man?" Long Yang's spirit and physical strength were very poor. Not only was he tired these days, but he also spent the whole night looking out of the window at the execution ground. This 70-year-old man was exhausted to the extreme. Even if the Mahist army didn't hurt Long Yang and didn't even eat the slightest bit of food, Long Yang's face and body still became extremely weak. Yili nodded and pondered for a moment before saying, "General Zhu Yan and Zhu Ling have died in the battle." Long Yang smiled helplessly and said, "This. I have already expected this. Zhu Yan has been copying people's hearts all his life. After 20 years of suffocation, it's a good thing for him to die on the battlefield. He is luckier than me. It's just a pity for Zhu Ling. That boy was thrown into the Jingwa army by his grandfather when he was just 10 years old. After more than 10 years of hard work, he took over the command of the Jingwa army, but I didn't expect." Shaking his head and sighing, Long Yang looked at Yili and said, "I heard that consort defeated Lei Tingfeng's hundreds of thousands of troops by yourself. We thought that Lei Tingfeng was used to being arrogant, so he was defeated. Now it seems that I am the arrogant one. Consort is no worse than a famous general. I admire you for being able to find the Jingwa army in just a few days. It's just a small trick. General, you flatter me. After a moment of silence in the small building, Long Yang asked, how did Zhu Yan die? General Zhu died for his country after the city was broken. Yili whispered. Well, he died for a good reason. Long Yang nodded. Looking at Yili, he said, in fact, even if Consort didn't come today, I still wanted to see Consort. Yili said in a low voice, General Long Yang, if you have anything to say, just say it. Long Yang sighed and looked out of the window at the empty execution ground not far away. He said, Consort must have heard that when I was young, I was also a cruel and merciless person who killed without blinking an eye. Yili nodded and said, yes, General Long Yang's name is not only famous in the western region, but also in the Central Plains. Chapter 672. Long Yang shook his head, what killing god of the West? When I was young, I didn't believe in the heavens, gods, or fate. I killed many people. Now that I've been idle for more than 20 years, I know my mistakes. However, I never thought that this old man's sins of killing would actually be reflected in my old age. This old man lost his wife in his middle age, and in his later years, he was all alone without any children. There must be some reasons. Yili was silent for a moment. She looked up at Long Yang and said, I understand General Long Yang's meaning. Long Yang nodded, although I'm old, I still have a good eye for people. Wang Fei has a peaceful nature and is not a bloodthirsty person. But Prince Ding, although I've only met him a few times, Prince Ding's brows seem calm and indifferent. In fact, his brows are like knives and his eyes are filled with killing intent. I'm afraid it's not a good omen. I heard that Wang Fei came from a famous scholarly family in Dechu State. You should know that war between two armies is inevitable. But wantonly killing innocent people is against the harmony of the heavens. Yili frowned. There was some displeasure in her eyes. She said lightly, General Long, Prince Ding didn't hurt anyone in Bian City. Looking at Yili's displeasure, Long Yang smiled and nodded, that's why I have to thank Wang Fei. If it weren't for Wang Fei, I'm afraid that Bian City would be covered in rivers of blood right now. Yili frowned and asked, what does General Long Yang want to say to me? Long Yang looked at Yili and said in a low voice, Wang Fei, please advise Prince Ding. The number of casualties on the battlefield is the will of the heavens. But killing innocent people outside of the battlefield is what a ruler should do. Yili's heart moved slightly. She looked at Long Yang calmly. Long Yang looked out the window with a disappointed expression. When a person is about to die, his words are kind. I'm not saying this for Xiling. It's purely what I've gained in half my life. If he allowed the blood to cover his eyes, there would be a day when his heart would be covered by the blood. Since ancient times, the battlefield has been a place that can turn living people into ghosts. Yili lowered her eyes, but her mind was in a mess. She understood what Long Yang meant. The battlefield was indeed a place where it was easy to magnify one's evil thoughts to the maximum. Yili had always known that Mo Xiuya was not what he appeared to be. Whether it was the initial gentleness and elegance, or the indifference and coldness. Or was it the occasional willful mischief that came later, carefree and unrestrained? How could a person who had suffered such a heavy blow and hurt, who had endured humiliation for so many years, and whose personality had completely changed, be so calm? At least, if it was her, she wouldn't be able to do it. Mo Xiuyao had hatred in his heart, but he was able to suppress it. His heart was filled with hatred, but he could only watch as Mo Jingqi died in front of him. He didn't do anything to take revenge. This made it easy for people to think that his hatred was not deep, or that he had gradually opened up his mind. But Yili knew that Mo Xiaoyao had never been a broad-minded person who would repay evil with good. This time, Mo Xiaoyao's sudden outburst was actually unreasonable. Long Yang's action of using the people of Dechu state as meat shields was wrong. But if it was a normal person, they would have caught Long Yang and cut him into pieces to vent their anger. But Mo Xiaoyao wanted Long Yang to live. He wanted to see the West Hill soldiers and even the West Hill people die one by one. He wanted Long Yang to live a life worse than death. He wasn't angry at Long Yang's actions, but he hated Long Yang, an extreme hatred. But in reality, there was no hatred between Long Yang and Mo Xiaoyao. There was no hatred in a fight on the battlefield. Long Yang could see all this, so Yili could naturally understand. So Long Yang was regretting. He didn't really regret using the people as meat shields. He regretted that his actions had drawn out Mo Xiaoyao's murderous intent, and even possibly unleashed a bloodthirsty demon. Yili looked at the old man in front of her, whose eyes were filled with worry. She said seriously, "He won't become that kind of person. He will be very good." Long Yang nodded and said, "This old man believes that Princess can do it. To have Princess Ding as his wife is Prince Ding's fortune." Yili smiled sweetly and said softly, "To be able to meet him is also my fortune." It didn't matter who was whose fortune. But Yili believed that Mo Xiaoyao was the right person for her. Even if there were people in the world more handsome than Mo Xiaoyao, more powerful and more capable than Mo Xiaoyao, there was only one Mo Xiaoyao. At this point, the two of them looked at each other and smiled. The atmosphere in the small building was so peaceful that it didn't seem like it was between the two sides. Yili was about to speak when the sound of steady footsteps came from downstairs. Qin Feng, who was standing at the top of the stairs, looked downstairs and gestured to Yili. Yili stood up and walked to the top of the stairs. The person downstairs had already come up. Seeing Yili, he was slightly startled. He smiled and said, "Li." Yili reached out and grasped Mo Xiaoyao's hand, pulling him into the small building. She smiled and said, "Why are you here?" Mo Xiaoyao lowered his head to look at her and said softly, "After dealing with official business, I wanted to take you out for a walk." "They said you came out." Yili smiled and said, "I had nothing to do this morning so I came out for a walk. I also wanted to pay a visit to General Long. You've been busy so early in the morning. Why don't you sit down and rest for a while?" Chapter 673. Mo Xiaoyao raised his eyebrows and smiled. Longshan Academy's headmaster, Mr. Xiaoding, Chen Xiufu. Hearing this, not only Yili, but even Long Yang showed a trace of surprise. Mr. Xiaoding's name was far less famous than Mr. Qingyun and the Su family, but this did not mean that Mr. Xiaoding's talent was inferior to Mr. Qingyun's. But compared to Dechu State, Xiling had always valued martial prowess and despised literature. There were not as many literati as Dechu State, and the status of literati was not as high as Dechu State's. And this Mr. Xiaoding indeed did not involve himself in politics. He only focused on teaching and educating people. Xiling, in the eyes of the people of the Central Plains, was not much different from Nanzhao and Beirong, but it was able to make Longshan Academy one of the three great academies. This was enough to prove Mr. Xiaoding's talent and knowledge. Longshan Academy and Lishan Academy had different ancient legacies. Longshan Academy had been developed by Mr. Xiaoding. Why is this Mr. Xiaoding still in Bian City? Why is he still here? Yili asked curiously. Mo Xiaoyao nodded and smiled. Of course. Even if he really wanted to kill everyone in Bian City, he had not really lost his mind. He knew what kind of people he could not kill or let go. And in this Bian City, there were only a few people with such value. Before Bian City had been conquered, Mo Xiaoyao had already ordered Qi Lin to control them. Even if they left first, they could not leave. Shall we go and take a look? Mo Xiaoyao asked softly. I heard that Mr. Shooting is quite troublesome. Yili also stood up. They would not stay in Bian City for long, so naturally they had to seize the time to take a look. Mo Xiaoyao let go of Yili's hand and smiled. I still have a few words to say to General Long Yang. Can Miss Li go down and wait for me? Yili glanced at Long Yang, who was sitting by the window. She nodded and said softly, I'll wait for you downstairs. Mo Xiaoyao only turned to look at Long Yang through the window when the footsteps had completely disappeared. The gentle smile on his face had long disappeared without a trace, and his gloomy eyes were filled with a sharp and murderous aura. If I hear you talking nonsense with Li again, I will definitely make you regret it. Although he didn't hear what Long Yang said to Li, the worry that flashed across Li's eyes when he came up didn't escape Mo Xiaoyao's eyes. Long Yang must have said something to Li that he shouldn't have said, which made Li worried about him. Long Yang looked calmly at him without the heart-wrenching pain and hatred from yesterday. He smiled faintly and said, Prince Ding is very fortunate to have such a Wang Fei. Mo Xiaoyao snorted coldly and stared darkly at him. Long Yang shook his head and said with a smile, Prince, don't worry. What can this old man say to Wang Fei? It's just a casual chat. Also, we don't have to see each other again. Speaking of this, Long Yang sighed with melancholy. Mo Xiaoyao stared at Long Yang for a moment and then suddenly laughed in a low voice. Long Yang, don't count on Lei Zhenting coming back. Even if he comes back, he can't save Xiling. I have 400,000 soldiers waiting for him at the border. There are also the hundreds of thousands of elite soldiers from Nanzhao. Do you think those soldiers have the time to come back? And the small countries of the western regions that you suppressed in the past, do you think they will take this chance to take revenge? Xiling is hopeless. Long Yang was stunned and only recovered after a while. He finally laughed helplessly, but his laughter was incomparably bleak and dispirited. As expected of Prince Ding, years of planning, as expected, it's fine if you don't act, but once you act, it's extraordinary. Forget it, this old man is old and should die. In the future, this old man will not care. Prince Ding, please. Outside the door downstairs, seeing Mo Xiaoyao stroll out, Yili smiled and went up to greet him. Mo Xiaoyao wrapped an arm around her slender waist and said in a low voice, Are we going to visit Sir Shooting now? Yili blinked and asked worriedly, Sir Shooting really won't chase us out? Scholars always had some pride in their bones. With Mo Xiaoyao's actions in Bian City, Yili would not be surprised if Sir Shooting directly charged at them with a knife, much less chase them out. Mo Xiaoyao snorted and walked forward with Yili. Who dares? Yili turned her head to glance at the small building with the windows still open and asked, What did you say to General Long Yang? What do you plan to do with him? Mo Xiaoyao's eyes flashed slightly and he smiled faintly. Tell him not to speak nonsense to Li in the future. Li does not need to worry about me. Yili was startled and reached out to take the hand around her waist. She said softly, I'm not worried. No matter what, we will be together. Mo Xiaoyao's expression relaxed and the smile on his face became even warmer. Li, do not worry. I have no interest in arguing with a half-dead old man. As long as he does not make a fuss, I will ignore him. Yili smiled faintly. In my eyes, are you not more important than him? Xiaoyao, I do not care how you deal with him. As a soldier, Long Yang's devotion to the country was indeed worthy of her admiration. However, Long Yang's body was riddled with blood debts. Coupled with his actions in Bian City, even if Mo Xiaoyao sentenced him to death, she wouldn't say anything. The fall of a famous general was a pity, but Long Yang was not innocent. The two walked further and further away until a soldier caught up from behind. With a panting voice, he said, "Prince, Wang Fei." Long Yang set himself on fire. Yili was startled. What happened? Turning her head, they could no longer see the small room where Long Yang was imprisoned. But they could still see the thick smoke in that direction. The soldier paused and said, "General Long Yang poured wine on himself and set himself on fire." Chapter 674. Hearing the soldier's report, Yili was stunned for a while. It was not until Mo Xiaoyao raised his hand to touch her that she came back to her senses. Li. Mo Xiaoyao looked down at his calm wife in his arms and frowned slightly. Yili shook her head and sighed softly. After Zhu Yan's death, another old general committed suicide in front of her. Rationally and emotionally, she could understand their choice. Because if it were her, she would not surrender to the enemy. The two old generals were loyal to the West Hill all their lives, and they died to protect their reputation. Whether it was the enemy or friend, they could only respect their strength of character. But Yili faintly felt that she could not stand it anymore. Perhaps she had seen too many deaths these days. Li, what's wrong with you? Are you not feeling well? Mo Xiaoyao asked worriedly as he supported her. Let's go back first, we can talk about other things tomorrow. Yili held his hand and shook her head. She smiled reassuringly and said, "I'm fine, we don't have much time to stay in Bian City. Pass down my order, bury General Long Yang with the general's rights. Just bury him with General Zhu Yan." Mo Xiaoyao nodded and ordered, "Do as Princess said." Go. The soldier took the order and left. Mo Xiaoyao waved his hand to let the people behind him leave. Holding Yili's hand, he walked slowly with one hand on her waist and whispered, "Long Yang and Zhu Yan are dead, Li is sad." Yili shook her head and said, "I don't know what's wrong, maybe the two old generals are too old. They are over 70 years old, but it's inevitable that they feel a little emotional." Mo Xiaoyao whispered, "If Li is sad, stay in the army and don't worry about these things." Yili smiled and said, "Does Prince really think that I am a delicate flower that cannot be blown by the wind?" No matter what, the two old generals were loyal to the country. Now that they're dead. Mo Xiaoyao said, "Do you think I'll bother with the dead?" If Mr. Li said to give him a grand funeral, then he would give him a grand funeral. Li, don't be sad for others, okay? Hearing Mo Xiaoyao's low voice, Yili raised her head to look at his eyes. She couldn't help but smile. She raised her hand and gently touched his slightly furrowed brows. "In this world, you, little Bao, grandfather, and uncle are the most important people to me. Apart from you, no one can truly make me sad. So, Xiaoyao, you must do well." "Of course I will." "And Xiao Bao. I will protect all the people Li likes. I will definitely not make Li sad. So, Li, don't pay attention to those irrelevant people, okay?" Mo Xiaoyao said in a low voice. Yili blinked. She looked at Mo Xiaoyao seriously and raised her eyebrows. "Irrelevant people? Isn't Li sad about Zhu Ling's death?" Mo Xiaoyao asked in a low voice. But Yili could still hear the anger in his voice when he said Zhu Ling's name. Chapter 675. The person sitting with his back to the door was startled, and then turned to look at the door. Realization flashed in his eyes. Prince Ding. Princess Ding. It was only then that Yili saw Mr. Shooting's appearance clearly. He was an old man with white hair and beard. His appearance was thin, and his temperament was elegant with a bit of the loftiness and arrogance of a scholar. He did not look like someone from the West Hill, but more like a scholar from the South. Yili pulled Mo Xiaoyao into the courtyard and nodded with a smile. Yes, Junior Yili greets Mr. Xiaoding. Chen Xiufu looked Yili up and down and snorted. I can't be called a junior by Princess Ding. Yili did not get angry and smiled. Mr. Xiaoding is very talented. Even my grandfather and uncle have a lot of respect for you. It is natural for me to call you a junior. Hearing this, Chen Xiufu was somewhat moved. Mr. Qin Yun and Mr. Hongyu. Although he had lived in the West Hill for a long time, he had heard a little about Princess Ding's family background. Yili smiled. Yes. Chen Xiufu was silent for a moment. His vigilant and slightly hostile expression softened a bit. He said lightly, when I was young, I traveled to Eastern Chu to study. I was also taught by Mr. Qin Yun in my studies. I also had some friendship with Mr. Hongyu. Of course. His gaze slowly swept over Mo Xiaoyao. I also paid a visit to the regent of Eastern Chu. Who would have thought that 30 years later, the descendants of Mo Lufang and the Su family have all become talents? It is a pity that I have wasted my time. I have not even taught half a successful student. Yili smiled. Mr. Xiaoding must be joking. At least half of the civil officials in the West Hill are your students. How can you say that you have wasted your time? The Longshan Academy was one of the 3 great academies in the world. It was not an undeserved reputation. Even though the West Hill valued military power over literature, it was impossible to let a group of illiterate generals take charge of the state affairs. Indeed, half of the officials in the West Hill were from the Longshan Academy. However, Longshan Academy was built by Chen Xiufu single-handedly. Compared to Lishan Academy and Cheonghua Academy in the south of Dechu State, Longshan Academy was lacking in resources and could only be ranked at the bottom of the top 3. But with Chen Xiufu's strength alone, in a place like the West Hill where martial arts were valued more than literature, Mr. Qin Yun also thought highly of him. As for the fact that the Dragon Mountain Academy did not have any outstanding disciples, it was understandable. Genom of Gojoseon had learned the lesson of Lishan Academy's influence in Dechu State. How could he let Longshan Academy repeat the same mistake? Chen Xiufu's strength alone was far from the Su family's 100 years of scholarly heritage. Even if there were outstanding disciples, they would have long been absorbed or dealt with by Genom of Gojoseon. As a result, Longshan Academy did not have a successor like Su Qingchen who could support the school. If Chen Xiufu passed away in the future, Longshan Academy would probably fall into the hands of Genom of Gojoseon or the Emperor of Xiling. Chen Xiufu's expression softened a little. He finally opened his mouth and invited the 2 to take a seat. After entering the parlor and taking their seats, there was naturally no one to serve tea at this time. Yili did not feel that it was beneath her status. She ordered someone to bring water and personally made tea for Chen Xiufu and Mo Xiaoyao. Mo Xiaoyao had not spoken since they entered the courtyard. Looking at Yili calmly pouring tea, a trace of tenderness flashed across his eyes. He glanced at Chen Xiufu warningly. Chen Xiufu drank tea and took in Mo Xiaoyao's gaze. He snorted lightly and was not afraid. Mr. Qin Yun, you are 80 years old, right? Are you well? After drinking tea for a while, Chen Xiufu asked. Yili pursed her lips and smiled faintly. Next year is my grandfather's 80th birthday. At that time, I hope Mr. Xiaoding will come to the northwest. The teacup in Chen Xiufu's hand paused. He calmly looked at Yili. He understood the meaning behind Yili's words. It was a pity that he could not agree. He regretfully shook his head and said, "It's a pity that this old man will not have the fortune to celebrate Mr. Qingyun's birthday. However, over the years, my Longshan Academy has collected a lot of ancient books. Princess, please bring them back to Mr. Qingyun." It can be considered this old man's congratulatory gift. Mr. Qingyun, to have a granddaughter like Princess, he is very fortunate in his later years. This old man will not add flowers to brocade. Yili pursed her lips and smiled. She said, Grandfather has never enjoyed the fortune of this younger generation. It is this younger generation that has caused him a lot of trouble. It is fortunate that Grandfather is kind and does not dislike the trouble that we younger generation have caused. Mr. Shooting has spent his life's effort for Longshan Academy. Do you really want Longshan Academy to disappear from the world? Chen Xiufu shook his head and said with a smile, Fate is like this. We cannot force it. Yili said indifferently, the so-called fate, isn't it chosen by people themselves? Although this younger generation is a woman, I also know that my fate is in my own hands and not in the hands of the heavens. There is another saying, personality determines fate and choices determine life. Mr. Qingyun is not a coward. Your choice determines the future of Longshan Academy. If you want it to exist, it will exist. If you want it to die, it can only die with you. Chen Xiufu was slightly shocked. He stared at Yili. After a long time, he sighed and said, My fate is in my own hands and not in the hands of the heavens. Personality determines fate and choices determine life. Princess Ding is so broad-minded. Prince Ding is so fortunate. Mr. Qingyun is so fortunate, then. What is Mr. Shooting's decision? Yili asked. Chen Xiufu lowered his eyes and said in a low voice, This old man will not submit to the Prince Ding mansion. His Highness Prince Ding is a hero, but killing me and turning me into hundreds of thousands of people is too cruel. When he said this, Chen Xiufu's voice became more hoarse and sorrowful. It was clear that he was extremely angry with Mo Xiuyao's actions. Mo Xiuyao raised his eyebrows and gave him a disdainful look. I will kill you. What can you do to me? Yili helplessly pulled Mo Xiuyao's sleeve. Mo Xiuyao curled his lips and lowered his head to continue drinking his tea. He also understood that it was absolutely useless to persuade someone like Chen Xiufu. Based on his actions in Bian City, even if he told the heavens, Chen Xiufu would not believe him. Even if he put a sword to Chen Xiufu's neck, this person might not believe him. Since that was the case, he did not need to waste the effort. If Li could persuade this person, he would stand on Li's side in the future. This was also a good thing for Li. Although Mo Xiuyao always acted spoiled and shamelessly in front of Yili, there were many things that he thought about in the long term that even young Master Qin Qin might not be able to reach. After pacifying Mo Xiuyao, Yili turned to Chen Xiufu and said, This is what this junior wants to ask Mr. Shooting for advice. Mr. Shooting has literary talent and can speak eloquently, but you should not casually slander my husband's reputation. Chen Xiufu was first stunned that Mo Xiuyao was so easily pacified by Yili. Now that he heard Yili's words, he was even more confused. He said with some displeasure, What does princess mean? When did this old man slander Prince Ding? Yili smiled faintly and said, Just now, this junior listened for half a day outside the door. Mr. Shooting's every word was saying that my husband killed the innocent. Is that not slander? Chapter 676. Chen Xiufu was instantly angered. He stared at Yili and said, Could it be that those people that Prince Ding killed yesterday deserve to die? Yili lowered his eyes and said lightly, Two armies fight for their own benefits. I have never heard Mr. Shooting say anything about how to deal with prisoners of war. The matter of killing the prisoners. Although Prince Ding was ruthless, there was a reason for it. Isn't Mr. Shooting's poem too much? Chen Xiufu stared coldly at Yili and said in a low voice, Could it be that the commoners in the city are not innocent? Yili blinked and said in surprise, What commoners? When has the Maoist army killed commoners? Chen Xiufu was also surprised. He had seen Mo Xiuyao take all of the commoners to the execution ground. Although Longshan was not high, the news of them being placed under house arrest in this courtyard was not widely spread. Naturally, he did not know that the commoners had been driven out of Bian City by Mo Xiuyao. Seeing Chen Xiufu's surprised appearance, Yili smiled and said, "Mr. Xiuting's information is probably wrong. General Longyang used the commoners of Dechu State as meat shields before the battle. This is not something that a general would do. Although the Northwest and Dechu State have already drawn a clear line, the Maoist army and the commoners of Dechu State are still of the same origin." My husband was angry for a moment. However, the Maoist army did not harm a single person of Bian City. I ask Mr. to investigate this matter. Hearing Yi Li's words, Chen Xiufu was a bit suspicious but also a bit happy. Longshan Academy had been in Bian City for decades. He naturally did not want to see those innocent commoners lose their lives. Carefully looking at Yi Li for a while, he finally determined that Yi Li was not lying to deceive him. Only then did he let out a sigh of relief. He stood up and cupped his hands towards Yi Li and Mo Xiuyao, saying, "This old man was wrong. I apologize to Prince Ding and Princess Consort." Chen Xiufu was different from Longyang and Zhu Yan. He had never been an official in the imperial court of West Hill. He had traveled around many countries when he was young and had seen a lot. On the other hand, he did not have a particularly deep obsession with the West Hill court. The characters, customs, and even bloodlines of the Dechu State and the West Hill came from the same source. The main reason he opposed Mo Xiuyao was that Mo Xiuyao had brazenly sent troops to invade the West Hill and wanted to massacre Bian City. Now that he knew it was a misunderstanding, he naturally didn't mind apologizing to Mo Xiuyao and Yi Li. Yi Li hurriedly got up to support him, saying, "Mr. Xiuting, you don't have to do this. You're staying on the mountain for the time being, so you're naturally a little inaccessible." Chen Xiufu sat down again and asked, "Then, where are the people of Bian City now? I don't seem to have seen anyone come back." Yi Li glanced at Mo Xiuyao and said with some shame, "The people of the city have all left." Chen Xiufu didn't need to explain what she meant by leaving. He couldn't help but frown. Although their lives were saved, hundreds of thousands of people had lost their homes. Many people didn't even have enough money to take their belongings with them. Their future days wouldn't be any better. Shaking his head, Chen Xiufu looked at Mo Xiuyao and said, "I remember, the area of the 4 states in the northwest is not very large. Prince's actions. I somewhat understand, but I can't agree." Mo Xiuyao raised his eyebrows and didn't answer. Chen Xiufu said, "Prince can't be thinking of driving away all the people of the West Hill and then moving the people of the Northwest and even the Dechu State here. Please forgive me for speaking bluntly, Prince's actions are even more inappropriate than massacring the city." Hearing this, Mo Xiuyao finally raised his head and asked lightly, "Why?" Chen Xiufu said in a low voice, "The people of the West Hill have lived in these places for generations. If Prince only wants to occupy a piece of land, it's fine. But if Prince wants to drive the people away, with so many people in the West Hill, where does Prince want to drive them to? Once they have nowhere to go, even if they are unarmed ordinary people, they will still fight back. It is true that there is enmity between the West Hill and the Dechu State, but the people of the West Hill and the people of the Dechu State may not have any deep enmity. 1,000 years ago, the West Hill and the Dechu State were originally one family. If Prince wants the land of the West Hill, he should know that he has to accept the people of the West Hill." Mo Xiuyao and Yi Li looked at each other. Based on Chen Xiufu's relationship and position with them, it was already profound for him to say such words. It even had some special meaning. Yi Li nodded and said, "Teacher is right. Last night's matter was indeed handled improperly by us. Teacher, please be magnanimous and forgive us. In addition, We have come to visit in the hope that you can help us make up for it. The events of the past 2 days had a great impact on the reputation of the Mahist army. Undeserved reputation was a small matter, but if the news of the Mahist army massacring a city was deliberately exaggerated, the future expedition of the Mahist army was likely to encounter unprecedented stubborn resistance, and even cause unnecessary losses. Qin Xiufu was silent for a moment, and then asked in a low voice, "What does Wang Fei want me to do?" Yili said softly, "Teacher Xiuding, please send out a notice to the people of the world that Bian City has returned to normal. The original people of Bian City who are willing to return can still return, and all their belongings will be returned. In addition, reopen the Longshan Academy. Teacher Xiuding, please recommend a few capable people who can help manage Bian City." Qin Xiufu calmly stared at Yili for a long time, but the two people opposite him knew that his heart was not as calm as it seemed on the surface. Yili's request seemed simple, but once he agreed, it was the same as announcing to the world that Teacher Xiuding would submit to the Prince Ding mansion. Knowing the hesitation and struggle in his heart, the two did not rush him, and calmly sat and drank tea. A long time later, a trace of determination flashed across Qin Xiufu's face. He looked at Yili and said, "I agree to Wang Fei's request, but I also ask the prince and Wang Fei to promise me one thing." Yili also sighed in relief and said with a slight smile, "Teacher Xiuding, please tell us." Qin Xiufu said, "I ask the prince and Wang Fei to promise that they will not kill the common people of Xiling." Yili smiled and said, "Of course. The Mahist army is not a bloodthirsty army, and has never violated the common people, has it not?" Qin Xiufu nodded and said with a smile, "I believe Wang Fei, and hope that the prince and Wang Fei will not break their promise." "Then please wait and see," Yili said with a smile. After sending off Yili and Nimo Xiuyao, the Mahist army soldiers who had been guarding outside the courtyard also left. This also showed the sincerity of the Prince Ding mansion. In the small courtyard, Qin Xiufu looked at the cold tea on the table in front of him and sighed faintly. "Teacher, are we really going to submit to the Prince Ding mansion? This will be detrimental to teacher's reputation. The Prince Ding mansion will not be able to stop the rumors from spreading," a young student behind Qin Xiufu asked worriedly. Qin Xiufu shook his head and looked up at the sky above the small courtyard. He said in a low voice, "Fame and infamy are all false." Seeing these two people, I suddenly feel that maybe the situation of the world is really going to change. The Dechu state and Xiling were the two great powers of the time. However, every scholar would remember that 1,000 years ago, there was a vast empire that stood on this land. That era was a time of peace and prosperity that countless people looked up to. There was a saying that, after being together for a long time, they would separate, and after being separated for a long time, they would unite. The world had been divided for too long. When those two people were in front of him, he seemed to finally see an extravagant hope that he had never dared to touch in his entire life, a true dream of peace and prosperity. But didn't teacher say that Prince Ding's evil spirit was too strong and harmed the harmony of the world? Isn't this a long-term phenomenon? The student asked in confusion. Qin Xiufu chuckled and said, "At that time, it was because I didn't see the other person. With her there, perhaps Prince Ding wouldn't have killed so many people. This time, weren't the people of Bian City fine? I was thinking too much. Teacher Qingyun has great foresight, how could he not see this? Since Teacher Qingyun didn't stop Prince Ding from sending troops, it meant that Teacher Qingyun also thought highly of Prince Ding. When he was young, Qin Xiufu also had great ambitions. Unfortunately, his ambitions weren't something that most people could understand. Even more people only thought of it as a kind of arrogant delusion. After hitting a wall too many times, he finally became disheartened and settled down in Dragon Mountain to teach and educate people. He hoped to pass down his ambitions and ideas. Afterwards, the Emperor of Xiling was cowardly and incompetent, Genom of Gojosian monopolized power, and the Dechu state Mo Jingchi was suspicious and ruthless. The entire Dechu state seemed to be strong and prosperous, but in reality, it was already on the decline. All of these things made him feel even more hopeless and helpless, until he completely gave up. He even dreamed of foreign invasions in the middle of the night. The Dechu state and Xiling no longer existed. He didn't expect that when he was almost 60 years old, he would once again see a glimmer of hope. For the first time in his life, Chen Xiufu was moved and helpless. He had already passed his prime. If only he was 20 years younger. Raising his head to look at the clear and cloudless sky, Chen Xiufu murmured, "This old man has accomplished nothing in his life. Death isn't regrettable. But now, I only hope to live a few more years. Perhaps in my remaining years, I can still see true peace and prosperity." Peace and prosperity. Behind him, the young student's heart shook. He didn't think that his teacher would have such high expectations for that wall of people. Although he didn't see Prince Ding and his wife with his own eyes, he hid behind and heard their conversation. As he watched the two leave, the young man also felt that there was no one in the world more compatible than them. "Teacher will definitely see that day," the young student said in a low voice. Chapter 677. With Mr. Xiuding's help, the situation in Bian City was much better than they had imagined. After all, in this chaotic world, it wasn't only Bian City that was at war. These ordinary people wouldn't easily choose to leave their homes unless they had no other choice. Although Chen Xiufu wasn't as famous as Mr. Qingyun, at least in Bian City, he definitely had enough prestige. Although there was a portion of people who were gossiping about him surrendering to Ding Wangfu, but after the citizens saw the notice that he personally wrote, most of them chose to return to Bian City. These ordinary people were very easy to appease. Long Yang's actions on the city wall gave the Mahist army enough and easy-to-understand reasons to explain Mo Xiuyao's previous actions. Although they were frightened and still had some fear of the Mahist army, after all, the Mahist army didn't kill any ordinary people in the end, right? Among them, perhaps the good reputation of the Mahist army played a big role. It took 2 days to settle some important matters in Bian City, including the burial of Long Yang and Zhu Yan as great generals. This action also made the people of Bian City, who were originally on guard, have a better impression of the Mahist army. After dealing with these matters, it was time for the Mo family army to continue their journey. Although they believed that with Lu Jingxian blocking, Genom of Gojosian wouldn't be able to come back to help so quickly, it was better to end this battle quickly. Mo Xiuyao left a small number of troops and temporarily led the people in Bian City. On the morning of the 3rd day, he took people and set off again. In a few days, the Northwest would naturally send people to take over Bian City. They couldn't leave a large number of troops along the way, especially when the Mahist army didn't have many troops. Just after leaving Bian City, Mo Xiuyao received a battle report from the Chu state. In the north, Linghuai was bitterly resisting the northern region army at Zijing Pass. The northern tribes' army in the north of Dechu state had finally broken through the borders of Dechu state. Countless nomadic cavalrymen of the grassland rushed into the pass, burning, killing, and looting along the way. At the same time, a large number of Dechu state citizens flooded into the northwest, and the Feihong Pass was also frequented by the northern tribes. Although they had no intention of provoking the Mahist army, Su Qingshan had to be careful. At this time, the Dechu state's court was still not united. The struggle for power was even more intense than before. As the regent, Mo Jingli did not throw all of his energy into the battle. Instead, he secretly made preparations. Once the enemy neared the Chujing, he would immediately abandon the Chujing and retreat to Jiangnan. After reading the letter he had just received, Mo Xiuyao threw the letter on the table with a dark expression. He said coldly, "Mo Jingli, that idiot. Sitting beside him, Yili picked up the letter and looked at it. She smiled faintly and said, "The northern region, northern tribes, and Xiling are all brave and skilled in battle. The armies of the 3 countries have all arrived. No wonder Mo Jingli retreated before he was defeated. Leng Haoyu and the others probably won't be able to hold on." Mo Xiuya pulled Yili to sit beside him. He lowered his head and rubbed her black hair. Ling Huai has finally lived up to his reputation for being able to hold on until now. If the northern tribes and Xiling didn't stir things up, and if the Dechu state's court supported him, the outcome would be uncertain. It's a pity, his luck is not on his side. It's not his fault. Enchanting really doesn't plan on withdrawing his troops from the Dechu state. Yili looked at the letter in her hand and asked with a frown. Mo Xiuyao snorted softly and said, "Lu Songxian's 400,000 troops are blocking the front, and the Dechu state's hundreds of thousands of troops are watching from behind. In the south, Nanzhao is eyeing covetously. That's right, there's also Murongshin leading 200,000 troops north. Enchanting can't retreat even if he wants to. If he turns back and is blocked by Lu Jingxian, and Murongshin catches up with him from behind and joins forces with the Dechu state's troops to surround him from 3 sides. The war god of Xiling, it's not impossible for his army to be wiped out again. Most importantly, even if he breaks through Lu Songxian's defense line and catches up, how many troops does he have? There's also the attack of Nanzhao and the small countries in the western region. At that time, he will have nothing." Yili furrowed her brows and thought for a moment. She asked then, "What do you think he will do?" Mo Xiuyao rubbed between his brows and thought for a moment. He said, "If he can't retreat, then he can only advance. If he can take Jiangnan before Murongshin and Mo Jingli, TSK, then it will be a bit troublesome." Yili had to admit that if Enchanting took Jiangnan, it would be a bit troublesome. Jiangnan was a rich and populous place that the West Hill could not compare to. Once Enchanting took it, it would only take a few years for Enchanting to become the overlord of Jiangnan. From then on, he would be free from the status and restrictions of West Hill's Genom of Gojoseon, and he would have even more power than he had now. If that was the case, it was hard to say whether they had won or lost this battle. Forget it. Even if we lose, the ones who lose are Mo Jingli and the Dechu state. We must take the West Hill. Mo Xiuyao said in a low voice. The Northwest had no other choice. Considering their reputation, they could not attack the Dechu state. Thus, the only choice left was the West Hill. They couldn't let the Mahist army go out of the pass to fight for territory with the northern tribes and become nomads, could they? Yili furrowed her brows and thought for a while. Then she smiled and said, "Maybe we are worrying too much. The Dechu state still has millions of soldiers. Mo Jingli is not so stupid as to let Enchanting take over his territory so easily. Besides, if it really doesn't work out, why don't we ask General Lu to help them again? Maybe we can still go back in time." They did not plan to take over the entire West Hill. No matter how weak the West Hill was, it was still a vast country. If they wanted to take over the entire territory, it would be impossible without 2 or 3 years. As long as they could take over the West Hill Imperial City in the shortest time possible, things would be much easier in the future. Mo Xiuyao smiled and lowered his head to kiss Yili's forehead. He said with a smile, "Yili is right. Let me think. Ling Huai's side is already powerless. Let him go back to the northwest. Of course, he would also bring back a famous general for them." Although Ling Huai was old, his ability to lead troops was definitely not below Zhang Qilan and Lu Jingxian. The Mahist army had not fought for too many years. There were basically no old generals in the army. The younger generation was also unable to hold their own. Thus, Mo Xiuyao had to personally lead troops into battle. As for how to make Ling Huai willingly work for the Mahist army, that would depend on his ability. Ignoring all this, Mo Xiaoyao casually placed the battle report aside and hugged Yili to study the map in front of him. Ever since he had Yili's Qilin training, Mo Xiaoyao had to admit that at least in terms of terrain exploration, it had improved a lot. In the past, even the most experienced scouts in the Mahist army could not explore and draw such a perfect map. They could even create a perfect battlefield sand table. Right now, Lei Dingfeng has brought 30,000 wounded soldiers to defend Feng City. Adding the original defenders of Feng City, the total number is no less than 150,000. It doesn't seem difficult. Let's leave this battle to Qin Yun. Mo Xiaoya pointed to the location on the map and said.